In the cool darkness of museum storage rooms across the world, clay tablets rest in archival boxes, their surfaces covered in wedge-shaped marks pressed into mud more than 4,000 years ago. Some of these tablets speak of grain harvests, of temple economics, of marriage contracts and property disputes, but others tell a different story. They describe gods who ruled from shining temples, gods who shaped humanity from clay, gods who decreed the fates of cities and kings, and in certain texts, recovered from the ruins of Nippur and Nineveh, from Uruk and Babylon, these gods turn weapons upon each other. The ancient Sumerians called them the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came, and according to the myths preserved in cuneiform script, these divine beings did not maintain eternal harmony. They rebelled, they conspired, they flooded the world to erase their own creation. They waged war in heaven and on earth, brother against brother, city against city, until the very temples built to honor them burned. Welcome. I'm glad you're here tonight, however late the hour finds you. Thank you for choosing to spend this time exploring one of the ancient world's most compelling mysteries. The conflict among the Anunnaki has fascinated scholars, theologians and seekers for over a century, ever since the first cuneiform tablets were deciphered and their stories began speaking again after millennia of silence. Here's what makes this topic so rich with wonder. The mainstream scholarly interpretation treats these myths as sophisticated theological literature, stories that encoded Mesopotamian understanding of natural forces, political power, and the relationship between divine and human realms. The conflicts among the gods reflected real conflicts among city-states, each with patron deities whose fortunes rose and fell with earthly empires. This interpretation is grounded in decades of archaeological work, linguistic analysis, and careful contextual reading of thousands of tablets. But alternative interpretations exist, and they deserve consideration too. Some researchers, looking at the same texts, ask different questions. Why such detailed descriptions of divine technology, of flying boats and cosmic weapons? Why do flood myths appear across unconnected cultures? Could these stories preserve distorted memories of actual events, of beings who possessed advanced knowledge, of catastrophes that reshaped the ancient world? The ancient astronaut hypothesis, popularized in the 20th century, suggests the Anunnaki were not mythological constructs, but visitors whose interventions were later mythologized. We're not here tonight to settle this debate. Scholarship continues, theories evolve, new tablets are still being translated. What we're here to do is explore the mystery itself, to understand what these ancient texts actually say, to feel the weight of questions that have persisted across 4,000 years of human wondering. What could drive gods to war? What do these stories reveal about the people who recorded them? And why do tales of divine conflict echo across so many cultures, separated by vast distances and centuries? Take a breath. Let yourself settle wherever you are right now. Maybe you're in bed, the day finally released. Maybe you're in a quiet room somewhere, the world outside distant and subdued. Wherever you find yourself, you're exactly where you need to be. Let your shoulders drop. Let the weight of the day begin its slow departure. We have time tonight, all the time we need, to travel back to the world that gave us writing, cities, the first great civilizations, to stand among temples where gods were thought to dwell in physical form. If this exploration brings you some peace, some wonder, perhaps you'd consider leaving a like or subscribing. It helps others find their way to these stories, these questions that connect us across the vast span of human memory. Thank you. Now then, close your eyes if you'd like. Picture the night sky above ancient Mesopotamia, the same stars that wheel overhead tonight. Imagine the Tigris and Euphrates rivers flowing through darkness, their waters carrying silt from distant mountains, building the land grain by grain, year by patient year. Somewhere along those rivers, 5,000 years ago, people gathered in settlements that would become the world's first cities. They planted barley and dates, raised sheep and cattle, and as their communities grew more complex, they developed something unprecedented: writing, not to record poetry first, but to track temple grain stores, to document offerings, to maintain order in an increasingly intricate society. But once humans could capture thought in physical form, once they could press marks into clay that would harden and persist, they began recording the stories that explained their world. Stories of creation and flood, stories of heroes and monsters, and stories of the gods themselves, the Anunnaki, whose conflicts would shape everything that followed. The tablets that preserve these divine wars rest now in climate-controlled archives, fragile and precious. But the questions they raise remain as alive as the day they were written. What truth lies beneath mythology? What can we know? What must remain mystery? Let's begin where the story begins, not with the gods, but with the world they would inhabit. The land between two rivers, before cities rose, before writing captured memory, when the Fertile Crescent was just beginning to emerge from the Ice Age's long retreat, a world waiting, silent and patient, for what would come. 15,000 years ago, the land that would become Mesopotamia looked nothing like the fertile plain described in ancient texts, where the great cities of Sumer would one day rise, where temples to the Anunnaki would pierce the sky with ziggurats of fired brick. There existed only arid steppe and scattered patches of wild grasses bending in wind that carried no human voices, no prayers, no names of gods not yet imagined. The Ice Age was ending, though not quickly by human measure. Glaciers in the far north retreated perhaps a meter per year, sometimes less, their meltwater feeding rivers that flowed with different courses than they do today. The Persian Gulf extended much farther inland then, its shoreline nearly 180 kilometers north of where it rests now. Sea levels worldwide sat roughly 120 meters lower than present measurements. The Tigris and Euphrates, those rivers that would define civilization, carved separate channels to the sea, not yet joined in the marshlands that later Sumerian texts would describe as the domain of Enki, god of fresh waters and wisdom. Temperature patterns shifted across millennia. Archaeological evidence from pollen cores and sediment analysis suggests the region experienced increasing rainfall between 12,000 and 6,000 BCE, transforming gradually from sparse grassland into more productive terrain. Wild einkorn wheat and barley grew in patches on hillsides to the north, in the Zagros Mountains and the uplands of what is now southeastern Turkey. These grasses had evolved over millions of years, their seeds designed by natural selection to scatter on the wind, to propagate without human intervention. No one farmed yet, not here. Hunter-gatherer communities moved through the landscape following game, gathering wild plant foods according to seasonal availability. They built temporary shelters, maintained toolkits of flaked stone, understood the movements of gazelle and aurochs, the wild cattle whose descendants would later pull plows through irrigated fields. The night sky held the same constellations visible today, the same stars the Sumerians would later assign to their gods, Dilbat for Inanna, Mulbaba for Marduk, the steady wheel of heaven turning over a world that knew nothing yet of written destiny. Archaeological sites from this period are rare and difficult to interpret. At Göbekli Tepe in southern Anatolia, dated to approximately 9,500 BCE, people who still hunted and gathered constructed massive circular stone structures, T-shaped pillars weighing up to 16 metric tons, arranged in rings and carved with images of animals, scorpions, serpents, vultures. This predates pottery, predates agriculture by perhaps 1,000 years. The effort required suggests organized labor, shared purpose, possibly the earliest stirrings of religious or ceremonial practice. What they believed, what stories they told around fires while carving those stones, remains lost. No writing would exist for another 5,000 years to capture their explanations of the world. The climate continued its slow warming. Rainfall patterns became more reliable in the river valleys. Wild cereals grew more abundantly. And at some point, in ways still debated by archaeologists, people began noticing that seeds could be planted deliberately, that certain plants yielded more food than others, that settling in one place and tending crops might provide more reliable sustenance than following migrating herds. This transition, the Neolithic Revolution, unfolded over centuries, not decades. It was not a sudden revelation, but a gradual accumulation of knowledge, trial and error, cultural transmission across generations. By 8,000 BCE, settled agricultural villages existed in the northern reaches of the Fertile Crescent. Jericho in the Jordan Valley supported perhaps 2,000 people, surrounded by a stone wall, sustained by cultivated crops and domesticated animals. Katal Hoyuk in Anatolia grew to even larger size, its houses built adjoining one another, accessed through roof openings, the dead buried beneath the floors. People were learning to shape their environment, to redirect water, to store grain in sealed vessels. They were developing surplus, and with surplus came the need for organization, for someone to manage distribution, to settle disputes, to coordinate planting and harvest. The stage was being set, though no one could have known for what. The great rivers in the south, the Tigris and Euphrates, flowed through land that would prove both challenging and extraordinarily productive. Annual flooding deposited fresh silt, renewing the soil's fertility. But the floods came unpredictably, sometimes violently, sometimes barely rising at all. Managing water here would require sophisticated engineering, communal effort on scales beyond anything village life demanded. It would require irrigation canals stretching kilometers, earthen dikes to control floodwaters, organized labor to maintain the systems. And it would require something else, a way to coordinate thousands of people, to establish authority, to create shared purpose. Perhaps this is where the gods first became necessary. not as distant creative forces, but as immediate presences who dwelled in temples, who owned the land, who demanded service and received offerings. The temples would become economic centers, administrative hubs, the institutions that made civilization possible, and the beings who inhabited those temples, the Anunnaki who would later turn against each other in divine civil war, would be understood as utterly real, as present and powerful as the flood that could destroy a year's harvest, as the drought that could bring starvation. But that development still lay centuries ahead. For now, around 6000 BCE, the southernmost reaches of the river valley remained largely unsettled. The land was flat, featureless, prone to flooding, difficult to predict. The water table sat high enough that digging wells proved simple, but drainage poor enough that salt accumulated in improperly irrigated fields. This would later become a chronic problem, soil salinization contributing to Sumerian civilization's eventual decline. Yet this same challenging landscape, once mastered, would support the densest population centers the world had yet seen. Imagine standing there in that proto-Mesopotamian landscape, 5,000 or 6,000 years before the Common Era. The sun rises over empty plains where Uruk will one day sprawl across 550 hectares, home to perhaps 80,000 people at its height, where the great ziggurat will rise in service to An, the sky god, where Inanna's temple will store tribute from subordinate cities. There is only wild grass, occasional tamarisk trees, the river's shifting braided channels glinting in morning light. The air smells of dust and distant water. Birds you wouldn't recognize today call from reed thickets. The silence feels complete, unbroken by human industry, by the sounds that will later define civilization, the ring of copper being worked, the grinding of grain, the chants of priests, the babble of marketplace crowds. The world was waiting, the conditions were aligning, and soon, in the great sweep of geological time, though still centuries by human count, people would begin moving south into this challenging, promising land, bringing with them knowledge accumulated over millennia. They would learn to control the rivers, to build cities in mud and reed, to organize themselves in ways that required new forms of authority, new explanations for how the world worked, new stories about the beings who governed human fate. The Anunnaki were coming, carried in the minds and myths of people who would press the first words into clay. The oldest readable writing in human history comes from Uruk, a city that rose on the banks of the Euphrates, in what is now southern Iraq, roughly 3,400 BCE. These earliest texts are not grand poetry or divine proclamations. They are accounting records, pressed into soft clay tablets about the size of a human palm, numbers and pictographs documenting temple property. So many sheep, so many bushels of barley, so many jars of oil. The symbols are crude by later standards, simplified pictures that represented words, not sounds. A circle with lines for grain, a triangle sitting on a rectangle for a female slave. Why did writing emerge here, in this particular place and time? The answer lies in complexity, outgrowing memory. Uruk, by 3200 BCE, sprawled across approximately 250 hectares, supporting perhaps 40,000 people. This was unprecedented density, a concentration of humanity that created logistical challenges no village had ever faced. The temple complex at the city's center, the Ana precinct dedicated to the goddess Inanna, controlled vast resources, agricultural land worked by temple dependents, workshops producing textiles and pottery and metalwork, granaries holding surplus against poor harvests. Redistributing these resources fairly, or at least maintaining the appearance of fairness, required tracking who contributed what, who received what, when obligations came due. Memory alone could not suffice. The system needed external storage, permanent records that could be consulted years later, that could survive the death of the administrator who created them. So the Sumerians invented tokens first, small clay shapes representing commodities, sealed inside clay envelopes. Then someone realized you could mark the envelope's surface with the shapes inside, creating a permanent record without breaking the seal. Then someone realized you didn't need the tokens at all if you marked the clay. And then, gradually, the marks became standardized, the pictographs became stylized, the wedge-shaped impressions made by a reed stylus pressed into damp clay became cuneiform, from the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge. For several centuries, this writing system recorded only economics, temple receipts, work assignments, land surveys, profoundly practical, entirely concerned with the material world. But once a technology exists, once humans can capture thought in persistent form, the range of what can be recorded expands. By 2600 BCE, cuneiform tablets preserve something different: names of gods, fragments of myths, the beginnings of religious literature. The Anunnaki appear in these early texts as a collective, not yet individualized with the detailed personalities and conflicts that later literature would provide. The word itself breaks down in Sumerian. Anunnaki, offspring of Anu, the sky god. They were understood as the great gods, the senior deities who held power over cosmic and earthly affairs, distinct from the lesser gods who served them, and from the Igigi, celestial beings, whose role would shift in different mythological traditions. Gradually, specific gods emerge from the collective noun, developing distinct identities and domains. And Anu, god of heaven, resided in the celestial realm and rarely intervened directly in earthly matters. His temple in Uruk, the Eanna, literally house of heaven, served as administrative and religious center. Enlil, whose name means Lord Wind or Lord of the Air, ruled the space between heaven and earth, the atmosphere, the breath. His cult center at Nippur would become the religious capital of Sumer, the city where divine assemblies convened to decide the fates of other cities. Enki, called Ea in Akkadian, presided over the Abzu, the freshwater ocean beneath the earth from which springs and rivers flowed. His city was Eridu, considered the oldest settlement in Sumer, the first place where kingship descended from heaven according to the Sumerian king list. These gods were not abstract forces, they dwelled in temples as real presences, their statues washed and dressed and fed daily by priests. The temple was literally the god's house, their earthly residence. Offerings brought to the temple fed the deity. The surrounding lands belonged to the god and were worked by temple dependents on the god's behalf. This created a structure where religious and economic power merged completely, where the priesthood controlled vast resources, ostensibly in service to divine owners, who communicated their will through ritual, divination, and royal decree. Think about what this meant for the people pressing these first divine names into clay. They were not recording abstract theology or distant mythology. They were documenting the ownership structure of their world, the power relationships that governed daily life. When a tablet listed tribute owed to Inanna's temple in Uruk, it was not metaphorical tribute to an absent concept. It was grain and livestock delivered to a physical building, managed by very real priests, redistributed according to hierarchies that placed the goddess at the apex. The archaeological record supports this interpretation powerfully. Excavations at Uruk uncovered the Eanna precinct's massive scale, temple platforms rising 13 meters above the surrounding plain, constructed from millions of mud bricks, decorated with colored clay cones pressed into walls to create geometric patterns. The labor required for this construction exceeded anything a small community could muster. This was organized civilization. Thousands of workers coordinated over years, fed from temple stores while they built monuments to beings whose power was considered absolute. Other cities developed their own patron deities. Belonged to Nanna, the moon god, whose temple dominated the city's sacred precinct. Lagash honored Ningirsu, god of agriculture and war. Babylon, which would later dominate Mesopotamia politically and theologically, elevated Marduk to supreme status. Though this development came much later, nearly 2 millennia after writing began, each city's prosperity became tied to its god's favor. Victory in war meant your god was stronger. Defeat suggested divine disfavor, or that the enemy's god had prevailed in heavenly councils. This is crucial for understanding the conflicts that would emerge in mythological texts. When stories speak of gods warring against each other, they reflect political and military realities. Cities competed for resources, for control of irrigation systems, for dominance in trade networks. These conflicts were understood through a theological lens. Our god fights their god, and the outcome in heaven determines the outcome on earth. The stars overhead witnessed all of this, unchanging while cities rose and fell. The Sumerians tracked celestial movements with impressive precision, developing mathematical astronomy that could predict lunar eclipses, that mapped the paths of planets against the fixed stars. They divided the ecliptic into 12 sections, early precursors to what would become the zodiacal constellations. These observations were not purely scientific curiosity. The heavens revealed divine intention. Unusual alignments, comets, eclipses, all carried meaning that priests interpreted as messages from the gods to human rulers. By 2400 BCE, cuneiform tablets preserve complex narratives, myths with developed plots and characterized deities. The gods speak, argue, love, rage, make decisions with consequences that ripple through divine and human realms. And increasingly, these stories describe conflict, not harmony, not eternal cosmic order maintained, but friction, resentment, outright warfare. The question that haunts anyone reading these texts remains: what were they describing? Political allegory, dressed as myth, cultural memory of actual historical conflicts, mythologized over centuries, something else entirely. events we can barely conceive explained in the only language available to Bronze Age scribes. The tablets rest silent on that question, offering only what was written. Gods who created humanity for servitude, gods who flooded the world when that creation grew too loud, gods who fought each other for supremacy, who betrayed trust, who schemed in divine assemblies, who turned the weapons of heaven against their own kind. We will explore what those texts actually say, but first we need to understand the divine hierarchy itself, the structure of power among the Anunnaki, before conflict shattered it. Picture a ziggurat at Nippur, the religious heart of Sumer, circa 2100 BCE. The stepped platform rises roughly 30 meters above the surrounding plain, its mud brick faces oriented to the cardinal directions with precision exceeding 1 degree of error. At the summit sits the temple proper, the Ekur, mountain house, dedicated to Enlil. From this height, priests can see across kilometers of irrigated fields, the Euphrates glinting in the distance, dust from the roads where tribute caravans approach. Inside the temple, away from the sun's hammer heat, limestone chambers stay cool even in summer's peak. The air smells of cedar oil, of incense burned in bronze censers, of the beer and bread offered daily to the god's statue. This statue, perhaps 1.2 meters tall, carved from imported diorite and dressed in woven garments, was not a symbol of Enlil, but Enlil himself, residing here in physical form, receiving offerings, witnessing oaths, dispensing justice through priestly intermediaries. This was the cosmic order as the Sumerians understood it, a hierarchy extending from heaven to earth, from supreme deities to lesser gods to humans to animals to inanimate matter. Everything had its place, its proper station, its assigned function. Disrupting that order invited chaos, divine punishment, the collapse of civilization into the formless void that existed before creation. At the apex sat Anu, god of heaven, whose name was often written with a star symbol that also served as the generic sign for divinity. Anu rarely appeared in myths as an active agent, remaining instead as the ultimate source of authority, the distant patriarch whose decisions shaped reality, but who delegated actual governance to more involved deities. His consort Ki, later known as Antu, personified Earth, though her role in the mythology remained surprisingly limited, given the importance agricultural people placed on land fertility. Perhaps earlier goddess traditions were gradually subordinated as patriarchal political structures solidified, a process visible in how Inanna Ishtar's power waxes and wanes across different periods and city-states. Beneath Anu in the divine hierarchy stood Enlil, and here we encounter a god who acts, who shapes events, who brings both order and catastrophe. Enlil controlled storms, the wind that could carry fertilizing rain or destructive tempests. He wielded the tablet of destinies, the authority to decree fate for gods and humans alike. At divine assemblies convened in his temple at Nippur, Enlil's judgment held decisive weight. To anger Enlil meant courting disaster, as numerous myths demonstrate. He was not cruel by nature, but absolutely committed to maintaining cosmic order, to enforcing proper relationships between divine and human spheres. Enki presented a different character entirely, god of the Abzu, the freshwater ocean beneath the earth. Enki was craftsman, magician, trickster, humanity's benefactor. Where Enlil enforced law, Enki found loopholes. Where Enlil pronounced destruction, Enki preserved. The tension between these brothers, sons of Anu, runs through Mesopotamian mythology as a defining dynamic. They were not equals in authority. Enlil outranked Enki in the divine council, but Enki possessed wisdom, cunning, creative power that sometimes achieved what force could not. Enki's city, Eridu, holds special significance in Sumerian tradition. The Sumerian king list, a text cataloguing rulers from mythical pre-flood times through historical dynasties, begins with the declaration, after kingship descended from heaven. The kingship was in Eridu. Archaeological excavations confirm Eridu as one of the oldest continuously occupied sites in southern Mesopotamia, with settlement layers extending back to approximately 5400 BCE. The temple sequence at Eridu shows continuous rebuilding and expansion over millennia, each generation constructing a new temple directly above the previous one's ruins, maintaining sacred continuity through architectural repetition. Nine-Hersag, the mother goddess, held rank equal to Enlil and Enki in some traditions, forming a supreme triad, called by many names: Ninmah, exalted lady; Nintu, lady of birth. She presided over childbirth and creation. Myths describe her fashioning humanity from clay, mixed with the blood of a slain god, giving humans both earthly and divine components. Her worship was ancient and widespread, but her role in later mythology diminishes somewhat, as male deities assume more prominent narrative positions. Below these great gods, the Anunnaki numbered 50 or 7, depending on which tradition you follow. 50 appears in some creation myths as the number of divine decrees Marduk receives when elevated to kingship. 7 shows up as the number of judges in the underworld, the 7 Anunnaki who decree the fates of the dead. The inconsistency reflects how myths evolved across centuries and cultures, how scribes in different cities emphasized different aspects of tradition, how political changes on Earth demanded theological adjustments in heaven. The Igigi formed another category of divine beings, generally understood as celestial gods who served the greater Anunnaki. In some traditions, the Igigi performed the labor of maintaining creation until they rebelled, forcing the creation of humanity to assume that burden. This myth, preserved in the Atrahasis epic, we will explore more fully in its proper context. What matters here is understanding that the divine realm was not egalitarian. It mirrored earthly social structures, rulers and servants, landowners and laborers, those who commanded and those who obeyed. Individual cities elevated their patron deities within this framework. At Ur, Nana the moon god received supreme honors, his temple precinct the largest and wealthiest in the city. The ziggurat there, still partially standing today, rose approximately 21 meters in its original form, constructed around 2100 BCE by King Ur-Nammu. Clay foundation pegs driven into the structure's base recorded the building's dedication, declaring Nana's ownership of the platform and the surrounding city. When Ur prospered, Nana's power seemed confirmed. When enemies sacked the city, as happened around 2000 BCE when Elamites destroyed the third dynasty of Ur, this was understood as Nana's abandonment, the god withdrawing protection in response to some failing. At Uruk, Inanna reigned as the city's primary deity, goddess of love and war, of fertility and destruction, of the morning and evening star. Inanna was daughter of Nana in some genealogies, sister to the sun god Utu, possessed of fierce independence and ambition that made her both celebrated and dangerous. Her myths, more than any other deities, show a goddess refusing limitations, demanding greater power, transgressing boundaries between divine and underworld realms. She would become central to understanding divine conflict, her actions catalysts for consequences that rippled through heaven and earth. This hierarchical structure was not abstract theology removed from daily life, it was the organizing principle of civilization. The temple owned the land. The god, through priestly intermediaries, directed agricultural production, managed irrigation systems, stored surplus grain, redistributed resources during lean years. Kings ruled as the god's earthly representatives, deriving legitimacy from divine selection, confirmed through ritual and military success. To question the divine order meant questioning the entire basis of social organization, risking not just religious heresy, but political rebellion. The night sky reinforced this cosmic structure. Each major deity corresponded to a celestial body: the sun for Utu, the moon for Nana, Venus for Inanna, Jupiter for Marduk, in later Babylonian tradition. These bodies moved according to observable patterns, their cycles tracked and predicted by astronomer priests who saw in celestial mechanics the physical manifestation of divine law. When planets moved in unusual ways, retrograde motion for instance, this required explanation, interpretation, possibly ritual response to address whatever divine disturbance the motion indicated. Imagine living within this worldview. Every drought meant divine displeasure. Every flood, every earthquake, every eclipse carried theological significance. Your city's military defeat proved your god had lost a heavenly battle or had withdrawn favor due to improper worship, ritual failures, royal impiety. The priests who mediated between human and divine realms held power not through military force, but through their claimed ability to interpret divine will, to perform the rituals that maintained cosmic order, to intercede when that order seemed threatened. And yet, within this structure, cracks appeared. The myths themselves, written by priests in service to this system, describe divine conflict, gods competing for supremacy, lesser deities rebelling against greater ones, brothers opposing each other, divine decisions made in anger or pride or fear. The very texts that justified hierarchical order also described that order breaking down, gods behaving in ways that mirrored human failings, jealousy, ambition, violence. What happens when the beings who guarantee cosmic order turn against each other? When the foundation of civilization, the divine hierarchy that makes society possible, fractures into civil war? The tablets that answer these questions, that describe the Anunnaki killing each other, were written by people who believed these events had actually occurred, whether in literal history or in the metaphysical realm that shaped earthly reality. They wrote in the shadow of ruined cities, of dynasties that had collapsed, of floods that had drowned civilizations. Their myths were not entertainment but explanation, attempts to understand why order gives way to chaos, why even gods cannot maintain eternal peace. We turn now to those myths, to the specific texts that describe divine warfare, beginning with the earliest recorded conflict, the rebellion that forced the creation of humanity itself. The British Museum in London holds roughly 130,000 cuneiform tablets in its collection, acquired primarily during the 19th and early 20th centuries when European powers competed to excavate Mesopotamian sites. Most of these tablets document mundane affairs, grain receipts, legal contracts, apprenticeship agreements, dowry arrangements, but scattered among the administrative records are texts that describe something else entirely, myths that scholars have spent over a century attempting to fully understand. Tablet K.3473, recovered from the ruins of Nineveh in what is now northern Iraq, preserves part of the Era epic, a poem describing divine madness and catastrophic violence. The tablet itself measures approximately 15 centimeters by 9 centimeters, its surface covered in neat columns of wedge-shaped impressions. The clay is pale brown, baked hard by the fires that destroyed the library of Ashurbanipal when Nineveh fell to invading forces in 612 BCE. Those fires, ironically, preserved thousands of tablets that would otherwise have crumbled to dust, turning sun-dried clay into ceramic that could survive millennia. The text describes Era, god of plague and warfare, becoming consumed by restlessness and rage. He tricks Marduk into leaving Babylon temporarily, then unleashes destruction upon the city and surrounding lands. Divine weapons are turned against human populations. The cosmic order maintained by Marduk's kingship collapses into chaos. Other gods watch in horror as Era's violence spirals beyond any justifiable punishment, becoming slaughter for its own sake. This is not allegory presented as such. The text treats these events as having occurred, as explaining why Babylon suffered certain historical catastrophes, why plague swept through populations, why warfare became total and merciless. Era's madness, his corruption by his own destructive nature, serves as theological explanation for suffering that seemed to exceed any proportional divine judgment. Other tablets from Nineveh preserve fragments of the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic. This text, originally composed perhaps around 1100 BCE, though preserved in later copies, describes a cosmic war between generations of gods. Tiamat, the primordial saltwater ocean, becomes enraged at younger gods who disturb her rest with their noise and activity. She creates an army of monsters, serpents with venom instead of blood, dragons whose mere sight brings death. The younger gods, terrified, elevate Marduk to kingship in exchange for his confronting Tiamat. The battle is violent and decisive. Marduk captures Tiamat in a net, drives fierce winds into her belly until she swells, then shoots an arrow down her throat that splits her heart. He dismembers her corpse, using half to create the sky and half to form the earth. From the blood of Kingu, Tiamat's consort and war leader, mixed with clay, Marduk fashions humanity to serve the gods and free them from labor. This creation through violence, order emerging from the death of chaos, became Babylon's foundational myth. It justified Marduk's supremacy over older Sumerian deities, theological support for Babylon's political dominance over southern Mesopotamia. The story was recited annually during the New Year festival, the Akitu, when the king's authority was ritually renewed through reenacting cosmic victory. From Nippur come tablets preserving the Atrahasis epic, dated to approximately 1700 BCE in its standard Old Babylonian version, though the story itself is certainly older. This text describes the first divine conflict, the rebellion that necessitated humanity's creation. The Igigi, lesser gods assigned to dig irrigation canals and maintain the cosmic infrastructure, grew weary of endless labor. They burned their tools, marched to Enlil's temple in protest, surrounded it demanding relief. Enlil initially proposed destroying the rebels. Enki, always the problem solver, suggested instead creating humans from clay mixed with the blood of a slain god, beings who would assume the labor burden. The assembly agreed. A god named Wealar, described as having rationality, was sacrificed. The mother goddess Nintu mixed his blood and flesh with clay, and from this combination the first humans were shaped. Humanity was created, according to this myth, specifically for servitude. We were not made in divine image as beloved children, but as worker replacements for rebellious gods. Our purpose was clear: maintain the temples, work the fields, free the Anunnaki from physical labor so they could attend to governing creation. The Atrahasis epic continues beyond creation, describing how humanity multiplied and grew noisy, disturbing the gods' rest. Enlil, driven to fury by the constant clamor, decided to eradicate this failed experiment through a series of catastrophes: drought, famine, plague, and finally the Great Flood. Each time, Enki secretly warned the human hero Atrahasis, instructing him on how to survive. The conflict between these two brothers, Enlil committed to order through destruction, and Enki preserving what he had helped create, forms the emotional core of the narrative. These are not isolated texts. Fragments of similar stories appear across dozens of tablets from multiple sites. Uruk, Ur, Sippar, Babylon, Ashur. They were copied and recopied over centuries. Scribal students practicing cuneiform by reproducing myths alongside learning multiplication tables and legal formula. The stories were not static but evolved. Different cities emphasizing different aspects, genealogies shifting to accommodate political changes, new gods being inserted while older ones faded. At the University of Pennsylvania Museum, tablets from Nippur, excavated between 1889 and 1900, preserve Sumerian versions of myths, known also from later Akkadian texts. The language differences reveal how concepts translated, or sometimes failed to translate, between cultures. Sumerian, a linguistic isolate unrelated to any known language family, operated according to different grammatical logic than Akkadian, a Semitic tongue related to Hebrew and Arabic. Reading divine conflict narratives in both languages shows how theological ideas migrated across cultural boundaries, how Semitic-speaking peoples who conquered Sumer absorbed Sumerian gods while transforming their stories. The question archaeologists and historians ask when examining these texts is fundamental. What historical realities, if any, do these myths preserve? Did specific droughts or floods inspire stories of divine punishment? Do wars between city-states appear in heavenly allegory as gods fighting gods? When Lagash and Umma fought over irrigation water and border territory for generations, their conflict mediated by appeals to Enlil at Nippur, did this earthly struggle create theological narratives of divine councils deciding between competing claims? Some scholars argue the myths are purely literary, imaginative theology, no more connected to historical events than Greek Titanomachy records actual battles between Titans and Olympians. Others see cultural memory encoded in narrative, distorted and mythologized but potentially preserving echoes of actual catastrophes, regional floods, epidemic diseases, political collapses that ended dynasties and left ruined cities. The debate continues. New textual discoveries and improved translation methods continuously refining understanding. What remains undebatable is that these stories mattered intensely to the people who wrote them. They explained why suffering existed, why civilizations fell, why even divine order could not guarantee eternal stability. They acknowledged that power, whether held by gods or humans, carried potential for abuse, for violence, for decisions made in anger or pride that shattered the very order power supposedly maintained. The tablets rest now in climate-controlled storage, their wedge-shaped marks still legible after 4 millennia. Touch one, carefully with gloved hands in a museum conservation lab, and you feel slight ridges where the stylus pressed, valleys between impressions. The clay is cool, surprisingly light, fragile despite its survival, and somewhere in those patterns of wedges and valleys, preserved in mud that hardened to stone, ancient voices still speak of gods who created and destroyed, who loved and hated, who turned against each other, despite the chaos such conflict invited. We will look closer now at the specific myths, beginning with the foundational story of rebellion and creation. Before humans existed, according to the Atrahasis epic, the work of maintaining creation fell to the Agigi, a class of younger gods whose function was fundamentally labor. They dug the great rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, channels that would water the land and make agriculture possible. They excavated irrigation canals, branching from the main rivers, networks extending across the plain. They dredged silt, maintained banks, cleared reed growth, work measured not in days but in centuries of cosmic time. The text is specific about the duration. 40 years they dug the watercourses. The effort exhausted them. Their hands blistered despite divine nature. Their backs ached. The work that seemed necessary for cosmic order to function ground them down, day after day, generation after generation, with no relief promised, no end visible. One night, the rebellion began. The text describes it simply. They burned their tools, set fire to their spades. They marched to Enlil's temple, surrounded it while the god slept, and demanded he hear their grievance. The scene carries tension despite its mythological distance. Gods confronting their superior, workers challenging management, the foundations of hierarchical order cracking under pressure. Enlil, awakened and informed of the uprising, reacted with fury. He summoned the other great gods to assembly, Anu and Enki joining him in council. The question before them was straightforward: what to do with rebellious subordinates. Enlil proposed simple punishment, destruction of the rebels to restore proper order. But Enki, hearing the Agigi's complaint, acknowledged its validity. The work was indeed too heavy, the burden unsustainable even for divine beings created specifically for that purpose. Enki's solution was pragmatic: create a substitute workforce. Take clay, the fundamental substance of Earth, mix it with something divine to grant intelligence and capability. Fashion beings who would assume the labor while freeing the gods to attend to governance and cosmic maintenance. The assembly agreed. The question became which god would provide the divine component, whose blood and flesh would be mixed with clay to create humanity. Withdrawn was chosen, a god described as having rationality, or understanding. The text does not explain why he was selected, whether he volunteered or was designated by higher authority. His sacrifice was necessary, the assembly determined. One divine death to prevent civil war, to address legitimate grievance while maintaining hierarchical structure. The practical mathematics of power. Here we encounter one of archaeology's remarkable moments, a discovery that demonstrates how myths preserved in multiple versions can suddenly illuminate each other when fragments align. In 1965, a team led by archaeologist W.G. Lambert, working with fragmentary tablets from the British Museum collection, identified a previously unknown section of the Atrahasis epic. The text had been broken into pieces in antiquity, scattered across different catalogued lots, its unity lost for over 2,000 years. Lambert, working in the museum's research room with tables covered in tablet fragments, noticed that broken edges of two separately catalogued pieces matched perfectly. The breaks were fresh, probably occurring during the tablet's excavation in the 19th century, rather than in antiquity. He fitted them together carefully, and suddenly a missing section of the narrative appeared, the actual description of Withdrawn's sacrifice and humanity's creation, previously known only from indirect references in other texts. The reunited tablet described the procedure in detail. Withdrawn was slaughtered in the assembly of gods. The mother goddess Nintu mixed his blood with clay, not randomly, but following specific proportions lost to us now. She recited incantations over the mixture, presumably spells that activated the divine component, that granted the clay rationality despite its earthly substance. Then she shaped the first humans, 7 males and 7 females, pinching off portions of the mixed clay as a potter works, giving form to figures that would become living beings. The text makes clear that humans carry both divine and earthly natures. From the slain god comes rationality, the capacity for understanding and following divine commands. From clay comes mortality, the inevitability of returning to earth. This dual nature explained, for the Mesopotamians, why humans could think and plan, yet remained fundamentally limited, capable of building civilizations, yet unable to escape death. The rebellion's resolution satisfied no one completely. The Igigi gained relief from physical labor, their grievance addressed, but divine blood had been spilled in assembly, a god sacrificed to solve a political crisis. Humans were created not from love but from necessity, to be exploited as the Igigi had been, though lacking divine nature meant human complaints could be more easily dismissed. And Enlil, whose initial response was violent suppression, now had to accept this compromise, allowing beings to exist whose noise and activity would eventually drive him to the same fury the Igigi had provoked. The myth does not celebrate creation but treats it as tragedy, a solution that addressed immediate crisis while sowing seeds of future conflict. Humanity would multiply, become noisy, disturb divine rest. Enlil would attempt repeatedly to reduce or eradicate the human population, sending drought, famine, plague, and each time Enki would intervene, preserving his creation despite his brother's wrath, setting up the cosmic tension that would climax in the Great Flood. What does this story reveal about the people who told it? They understood their own existence as fundamentally marked by conflict, divine disagreement about whether humanity should even exist. They saw labor not as noble calling or path to fulfillment, but as burden originally assigned to gods who found it unbearable. They created theology that acknowledged the arbitrary nature of power, how decisions made to preserve divine order could require sacrifice of the innocent, how compromise satisfied no party fully. This was not escapist mythology, but unflinching acknowledgement of how systems work, how hierarchies maintain themselves through violence or threat of violence, how even cosmic order depends on someone performing the difficult labor that makes order possible. The gods who created humans were not loving parents but managers solving a workforce problem, and humans, knowing this truth, recorded it in clay, teaching the story to generation after generation of scribal students who copied it alongside tax records and hymns of praise to the very gods who admitted creating humans for servitude. The rebellion of the Igigi was the first divine civil conflict, and it established patterns that would repeat. Grievance ignored until explosion, power responding with violence, compromise forged only when alternatives proved worse, and solutions creating new problems that would fester until they too erupted into crisis. We turn now to the central rivalry, the conflict between brothers that would shape every subsequent divine war. In the cosmology preserved on clay, Anu the sky god fathered two sons who would govern creation's daily operation, Enlil and Enki. Genealogies vary across texts, some making them full brothers, others half-brothers born to different mothers. What remains constant is their fundamental opposition, not as enemies precisely, but as forces in perpetual tension, neither able to fully overcome the other's influence. Enlil received authority over the air, the space between heaven and earth where weather formed, where storms gathered. His domain was order, law, the enforcement of cosmic hierarchy. Texts describe him holding the Tablet of Destinies, a physical object conferring power to decree fate, to make pronouncements that bound both gods and humans. When divine assemblies convened, they met at Enlil's temple in Nippur, the Eka, and his judgment carried decisive weight, even though Anu theoretically outranked him. Enlil was not distant like his father, but actively engaged in governance, quick to anger when order was threatened, capable of tremendous violence in order's defense. Enki's domain was water, specifically the Abzu, the freshwater ocean beneath the earth from which springs and rivers emerged. But more fundamentally, Enki was the god of wisdom, magic, craft, esoteric knowledge. Where Enlil governed through authority and force, Enki worked through cunning and creativity. He was the craftsman who fashioned solutions, the magician who spoke incantations that altered reality, the keeper of the Mi, divine powers, or cosmic principles that governed everything from kingship to brewing beer. The Mi deserve explanation, as they represent a distinctly Mesopotamian concept. They were not laws exactly, nor magical artifacts, but something closer to fundamental patterns or templates by which things function properly. There was a Mi for kingship, a Mi for priesthood, a Mi for warfare, a Mi for weaving, dozens or even hundreds of these cosmic principles that made civilization possible. Enki possessed them, kept them in his temple at Eridu, and their theft or redistribution became the subject of important myths. Archaeological excavations at Eridu, conducted between 1946 and 1949 by Iraqi and British teams, revealed the site's extraordinary antiquity. Temple levels extend down through nearly 5 meters of accumulated deposits, each temple built directly above the ruins of its predecessor, maintaining architectural continuity from approximately 400 BCE through to the site's abandonment around 600 BCE. The earlier structures were small, single-room buildings with altars, barely 3 meters by 4 meters in dimension. Over millennia, each generation expanded and elaborated, the temples growing larger and more architecturally sophisticated, while maintaining the same orientation and basic plan. This physical continuity reflects theological continuity. Eridu was considered the first city, the place where civilization began when kingship descended from heaven, and Enki, its patron deity, was understood as the god who made civilization possible by providing humans with knowledge, agriculture, metalworking, writing, the arts and technologies that separated civilization from wilderness. But Enki's relationship with humanity went deeper than practical instruction. Multiple myths portray him as humanity's defender against Enlil's wrath. When Enlil decided to destroy humans through the flood, it was Enki who warned Atrahasis, instructing him to build a boat and save his family and livestock. When Enlil sent drought, Enki opened hidden springs to provide water. When Enlil released plague, Enki taught healing arts. The pattern repeats. Enlil enforces cosmic order by eliminating what he views as disorder, and Enki subverts that enforcement by preserving what Enlil condemns. Why this opposition? The myths suggest fundamentally different philosophies. Enlil valued stability, predictability, clear hierarchies where everyone knew their place and performed their assigned function. Deviation from proper order invited chaos, and chaos threatened existence itself. Better to destroy a troublesome creation than allow disorder to spread. This was not cruelty, but cosmic pragmatism, the willingness to make hard decisions that preserved the system. Enki valued creation itself, the proliferation of life and knowledge, the clever solution that preserved what brutal force would eliminate. He saw potential where Enlil saw threat. He believed in humanity's capacity to learn, to improve, to become worthy of existence rather than simply performing servitude. This made him trickster and rebel, working within divine hierarchy while consistently undermining its harsher edicts. The conflict came to a head in the flood narrative, preserved in multiple versions across Sumerian, Akkadian, and later sources. The story appears in the Atrahasis epic, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, in Sumerian flood myths that may predate the Akkadian versions. The basic structure remains consistent. Humanity has multiplied and grown noisy, disturbing divine rest. Enlil proposes eradication through flood. The divine assembly agrees, binding themselves by oath not to warn humans. Enki, bound by the oath, finds a loophole. He speaks not to the human Atrahasis directly, but to the reed wall of the man's house, telling the wall to instruct the man to build a boat. The boat's construction follows specific dimensions, roughly 60 meters by 60 meters, 7 decks tall, coated with pitch inside and out to make it watertight. The text preserves detailed engineering, suggesting real knowledge of shipbuilding applied to mythological scale. Atrahasis brings aboard his family, livestock, craftsmen with their tools, wild animals, everything necessary to restart civilization after the deluge. The flood itself is described with visceral power. 7 days and nights the storm rages. The text says the gods cowered like dogs crouching against the outer wall. Even the deities who decreed the flood are terrified by its violence, by destruction exceeding what they intended. Inanna weeps, crying out that she regrets supporting Enlil's decision, that humanity should not be erased so completely. When the waters recede and Atrahasis emerges, he offers sacrifice. The gods who have not received offerings during the flood smell the roasting meat and gather like flies around the altar, suddenly aware of their dependence on human worship, on the system they nearly destroyed. Enlil revives last, furious to discover humans survived, demanding to know who broke the oath of silence. The reunited tablet described the procedure in detail. Wiela was slaughtered in the assembly of gods. The mother goddess Nintu mixed his blood with clay, not randomly, but following specific proportions lost to us now. She recited incantations over the mixture, presumably spells that activated the divine component, that granted the clay rationality despite its earthly substance. Then she shaped the first humans, 7 males and 7 females, pinching off portions of the mixed clay as a potter works, giving form to figures that would become living beings. The text makes clear that humans carry both divine and earthly natures. From the slain god comes rationality, the capacity for understanding and following divine commands. From clay comes mortality, the inevitability of returning to earth. This dual nature explained, for the Mesopotamians, why humans could think and plan, yet remained fundamentally limited, capable of building civilizations yet unable to escape death. Enki's defense is remarkable. He does not deny his action but argues its necessity. Humans were not destroyed for genuine crimes, but for existing too successfully, for multiplying as they were created to do. The punishment exceeded any reasonable proportion. And now, with humanity preserved, the divine assembly could establish limits on population growth through natural deaths, through infertility, through regulating birth rates, rather than requiring periodic genocidal floods. Enlil accepts this argument, or perhaps simply recognizes that with humans already preserved, there is no point in continued conflict. He grants Atrahasis and his wife immortality, sending them to live at the mouth of the rivers where fresh and salt water meet, the boundary between ordered world and chaos. This reward also serves as removal, placing the flood survivors beyond normal human society, preventing them from interfering further in divine plans. The story's implications ripple through Mesopotamian thought. It acknowledges divine imperfection, decisions made in anger and later regretted. It shows gods dependent on humans despite claiming superiority, unable to maintain their own temples and worship without human service. It demonstrates that even unanimous divine decrees can be subverted by clever interpretation, that law contains loopholes for those wise enough to find them. Most importantly for our exploration of divine civil war, it shows Enki and Enlil locked in perpetual opposition, neither able to eliminate the other, neither willing to fully yield. Enlil cannot kill Enki, his brother and fellow child of Anu. Enki cannot openly defy Enlil without risking divine assembly's punishment. So they maneuver, finding indirect methods to pursue contradictory goals, turning cosmic governance into chess match where humans are pieces moved and sacrificed in games we barely comprehend. The stars above Mesopotamia witness this theological drama, the same stars watching tonight, and beneath those stars people lived and died, and pressed stories into clay, trying to understand why existence felt like war, why even gods could not maintain peace, why order always seemed one catastrophe away from collapse into chaos. The conflict between Enlil and Enki was foundational, the bedrock opposition from which other divine wars emerged. We will see how other gods learned from their example, how ambition and resentment grew in divine hearts, until the heavens themselves became battlefield. Around 2100 BCE, the city of Ur reached its zenith under the Third Dynasty, a period historians call the Ur-Third period. King Ur-Nammu and his son Shulgi transformed Ur from regional center into imperial capital, controlling trade routes extending from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. administering provinces through governors who reported to centralized bureaucracy. The city sprawled across roughly 60 hectares, surrounded by walls of baked brick that rose perhaps 8 meters high, thick enough at the base that chariots could drive along the top. At the city's heart stood the ziggurat dedicated to Nana, the moon god, Ur's divine patron and protector. The structure rose approximately 21 meters in 3 massive stages, each level smaller than the one below, creating the stepped profile characteristic of Mesopotamian sacred architecture. The core was mud brick, millions of them, covered with baked brick facades laid in bitumen mortar. Access to the summit came via 3 monumental staircases, 2 flanking the structure's sides and 1 perpendicular at the center, all converging at the first level, before a single stairway continued upward to the temple proper. Standing at the ziggurat's base, you would tilt your head back to see the shrine at the summit, small against the sky, priests moving there like distant birds. The air would smell of smoke from constant sacrifices, of beer and bread offered daily to the god, of the city itself pressing close around the sacred precinct, leather tanning in workshops, fish drying on racks, sewage flowing through brick-lined drains beneath the streets. Was not abstract grandeur but living density. Perhaps 65,000 people crowded into space smaller than a modern university campus. The administrative archives from this period, tens of thousands of tablets recovered from excavations, reveal bureaucratic sophistication that rivals any pre-modern state. Records track individual workers by name, documenting their rations down to specific quantities of barley, oil, and wool issued monthly. Temple complexes managed vast agricultural estates, recording seed grain distributed to fields, harvest yields returned to granaries, surplus sold or traded to other cities. Scribes calculated interest on loans, 5 shekels per 60 per year, roughly 20% annually. They tracked livestock by type and age, noting births, deaths, animals slaughtered for temple feasts or sent as tribute to the capital. This was civilization operating at scale, the complex choreography of resource management that kept thousands fed, clothed, employed in specialized labor. Weavers produced textiles from temple wool. Metalworkers cast bronze tools and weapons in controlled ratios of copper and tin. Potters shaped vessels on wheels turned by apprentices. Merchants traveled overland to Anatolia for silver, sailed to Dilmun in the Persian Gulf for copper, crossed deserts to Syria for timber that Mesopotamia lacked. The system worked, wealth accumulated, temples grew larger, kings commissioned monuments celebrating their piety and power. But the system depended on divine favor, on Nana maintaining protection over his city. Temple rituals aimed to preserve that favor. Daily washing and dressing of the god's statue, monthly festivals, annual ceremonies where the king ascended the ziggurat to receive divine approval for another year's reign. The relationship between god and city was understood as covenant, mutual obligation. The city provided worship, offerings, properly maintained temples. The god provided protection, prosperity, victory over enemies. Around 2000 BCE, that covenant shattered. Elamite forces from the east invaded southern Mesopotamia, sweeping through cities that had depended on Ur's imperial protection. The reasons for Ur III's collapse remain debated by historians. Overextension of imperial administration, environmental changes affecting agriculture, shifts in trade routes, internal political fragmentation. Whatever the causes, the result was catastrophic. Elam's armies besieged Ur, broke through its walls, sacked the temples, enslaved the population, and burned the city. A text called The Lamentation over the Destruction of Ur preserves the theological crisis this created. The poem, over 400 lines in its most complete version, describes in anguished detail how Nana abandoned his city. The god is portrayed pleading with Enlil in divine assembly, begging him to spare Ur from destruction. Enlil refuses. The fate has been decreed. Ur must fall. Nana, weeping, withdraws his protection. Without the god's presence, the city becomes defenseless. The lamentation describes empty temples, broken statues, fires consuming sacred precincts. It names specific neighborhoods, listing them one by one as they fall to enemy action. It describes women violated, children killed, elders left unburied. The language is not abstract but horrifyingly specific, suggesting eyewitness accounts transformed into liturgical poetry. This was not distant mythology but recent trauma, collective memory of catastrophe, preserved in ritual recitation. What makes this text so theologically challenging is its admission of divine failure, or perhaps divine cruelty. Nana did not lose to a stronger god. He did not fail to protect his city through weakness. He withdrew deliberately, in obedience to Enlil's decree, leaving his worshippers to slaughter. The text struggles with this, asking why the god would permit such suffering, What crime Ur committed to deserve total destruction? No satisfactory answer emerges. The will of Enlil is given as explanation, but that only pushes the question back. Why did Enlil decree Ur's fall? Some scholars interpret this as political theology, the winning side's gods proving superior to the losers, but the lamentation was composed and recited by Sumerians, not by victorious Elamites. It was self-examination, an attempt to understand catastrophe within theological framework that assumed gods controlled historical outcomes. If Ur fell, Nana must have permitted or caused that fall, and if Nana permitted it despite his people's devotion, what did that say about divine justice, about whether proper worship guaranteed protection? The ziggurat still stands, partially reconstructed in modern times, but with its ancient core visible. Saddam Hussein's government rebuilt portions in the 1980s, adding modern brick clearly distinguishable from ancient material. You can climb the reconstructed stairs, stand where priests stood 4,000 years ago, look out over the ruins of the city spreading in all directions, house foundations, temple platforms, the harbour district, where ships once docked, bringing trade goods from across the known world. Standing there, you feel the weight of theological crisis made physical. The god's house remains, monumentally present, but the god withdrew, and the city died. The lamentation asks how this could happen, and receives no comfortable answer, only that Enlil decreed it, that divine will supersedes human righteousness, that even perfect devotion cannot guarantee survival when cosmic politics shift. This was divine civil war made manifest in earthly destruction, not gods directly fighting in heaven, but gods withdrawing protection, gods permitting catastrophe, gods prioritizing their own conflicts over human welfare. The people of Ur learned that being Nana's chosen city meant nothing if Enlil decided otherwise, and the gods themselves are portrayed as anguished by this, Nana weeping, other deities mourning, even as they enforce the assembly's decree. What drove these decisions? What politics played out in divine councils that could condemn entire cities? We will see how individual gods, ambitious and resentful, began actively challenging the cosmic order that had supposedly been established since creation. Among all the Anunnaki, no deity proved more transgressive, more willing to overstep boundaries and demand greater power than Inanna, goddess of love and warfare, of the morning and evening star, of sexual desire and violent conquest. She embodied contradictions that made her both celebrated and dangerous. Her myths describe a goddess who refused limitation, who seized power rather than waiting for it to be granted, who challenged even the rules governing life and death. Inanna's primary cult center was Uruk, where her temple, the Anar, formed the city's religious and economic heart. Archaeological excavations there between 1912 and 1913, and again in extensive campaigns from the 1920s through 1980s, revealed the temple's massive scale. The precinct covered roughly 9 hectares, containing multiple shrine buildings, administrative wings, workshops, storerooms, courtyards, large enough for festival gatherings of thousands. Foundation deposits contained stone vessels imported from hundreds of kilometers away, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, obsidian from Anatolia, demonstrating the wealth Inanna's temple commanded. One of the most famous myths concerning Inanna describes her theft of the Mi from Enki's temple in Eridu. The story begins with Inanna traveling to visit her father's brother, arriving at the Abzu where Enki resides. Enki, pleased by his niece's visit, hosts a feast. They drink beer together, multiple rounds, the text listing 7 stages of intoxication. As Enki grows increasingly drunk, he begins offering Inanna the Mi, the divine powers he guards, the Mi of kingship, of priesthood, of warfare, of sexual allure, of craftsmanship, dozens of cosmic principles that govern civilization's functions. Inanna accepts each gift, loading them onto her boat of heaven. When Enki sobers and realizes what he has done, he sends his minister Isimud to retrieve the Mi before Inanna reaches Uruk. But at each stopping place on the journey between Eridu and Uruk, Inanna's minister Ninshubur defends the boat, arguing that Enki gave these powers freely and cannot reclaim them. Eventually Inanna arrives at Uruk with the Mi intact, distributing them throughout her city, making Uruk supreme in the arts and knowledge they represent. This is not a story of divine harmony, but of power transfer through trickery. Inanna did not receive the Mi through proper channels, through her place in divine hierarchy. She manipulated her uncle's weakness, exploited hospitality customs that prevented him from refusing to share drink with family, and when he attempted to correct his mistake, she relied on her minister's strength to maintain possession of stolen property. The myth celebrates this, portraying Inanna as clever and bold, someone who takes what she wants rather than accepting assigned limitations. But Inanna's most famous transgression, the act that nearly destroyed cosmic order, was her descent to the underworld. This myth exists in both Sumerian and later Akkadian versions, with significant differences between them. In the Sumerian version, Inanna decides to visit the underworld ruled by her sister Ereshkigal, perhaps to extend her dominion there, to become goddess of both life and death. She dresses in her full regalia, crown, lapis lazuli beads, royal robe, breastplate, all the symbols of her divine authority. At each of the underworld's 7 gates, the gatekeeper demands she remove one item of clothing or jewelry before passing through. This is the law. No one enters the land of death retaining the powers of life. Inanna protests at each gate, but ultimately complies, arriving before her sister naked and powerless. Ereshkigal and the 7 judges of the underworld condemn Inanna to death. Her corpse is hung on a hook like a piece of meat. In the world above, everything stops. Without Inanna, there is no sexual desire, no conception, no birth. Fertility ceases. This creates crisis that reaches the divine assembly. Enki, always the problem solver, fashions 2 genderless beings from the dirt beneath his fingernails, creatures neither alive nor dead, who can travel to the underworld without being subject to its laws. They descend, find Ereshkigal writhing in labor pains with no one to comfort her, and offer sympathy. Moved by their compassion, Ereshkigal grants them a boon. They ask for Inanna's corpse. The mourning creatures sprinkle the corpse with food and water of life, reviving Inanna. But the underworld's law is absolute. No one leaves unless they provide a substitute to take their place. Demons accompany Inanna back to the surface, searching for her replacement. They pass various gods who are mourning Inanna's death, clothed in sackcloth and ashes, but Inanna protects them. Then they reach Uruk and find Dumuzi, Inanna's husband, sitting on her throne dressed in fine clothes, apparently unconcerned by her absence. Inanna's fury is immediate. She fixes the eye of death upon Dumuzi, designating him as her substitute. Dumuzi flees, transforming into a gazelle, but the demons pursue him. Eventually a compromise is reached. Dumuzi will spend half the year in the underworld, his sister Geshtinanna the other half. This alternation explains the seasons, the annual dying and revival of vegetation, the cycle of fertility and barrenness that agricultural peoples recognized as fundamental to existence. The myth reveals multiple layers of meaning. On one level, it is an etiology, explaining natural cycles through divine narrative. On another, it shows the consequences of overreaching ambition. Inanna attempted to conquer death itself, to add the underworld to her domains, and nearly destroyed creation in the process. Her sister Ereshkigal, often portrayed as bitter and isolated in her underground realm, finally had her status acknowledged. Some territories cannot be invaded, some boundaries cannot be crossed without catastrophic cost. But the myth also shows divine marriage as political arrangement, rather than romantic partnership. Dumuzi's apparent indifference to Inanna's death, his assumption of her throne in her absence, suggests he viewed her disappearance as opportunity rather than tragedy. And Inanna's willingness to condemn him to death for this reveals that divine love, like divine power, contained violence and betrayal as fundamental components. In 1951, American archaeologist Samuel Noah Kramer was working in the Istanbul Museum's tablet collection, examining Sumerian texts acquired from various Iraqi sites decades earlier. Among fragments catalogued but not fully translated, he found pieces of a tablet describing Inanna's descent. The text was fragmentary, portions missing where the clay had broken, but enough remained to confirm this was an older version than the Akkadian descent of Ishtar previously known. Kramer spent weeks identifying other fragments that might belong to the same tablet, working by lamplight in the museum's storage rooms. He found several pieces in different catalogue numbers, their breaks matching precisely when he held them together. Gradually, he reconstructed about 2/3 of the complete text, filling gaps with educated guesses based on parallel passages in other myths. When he published his translation in 1951, it revealed that the Sumerian version, predating the Akkadian by perhaps 500 years, contained theological elements the later version had softened or removed. The Sumerian Inanna is harsher, less sympathetic, more willing to use others as her substitutes. The later Akkadian Ishtar shows more nuance, more complexity of emotion. This evolution suggests how myths changed as they were retold, how different cultures emphasized different aspects, how theological needs shaped the stories preserved for posterity. Inanna's myths, more than any other deities, show a god actively creating conflict through ambition and transgression. She stole from Enki, invaded the underworld, condemned her husband to death, constantly pushed against limitations that other gods accepted. Her actions forced other deities to respond, to establish new rules, to negotiate compromises that prevented total cosmic collapse. She was both necessary, fertility and warfare required her presence, and dangerous, her refusal to accept boundaries threatening the order others tried to maintain. The evening star still rises in the west just after sunset, the same planet Venus that the Sumerians identified with Inanna. It shines bright and steady, third brightest object in the sky after sun and moon, and people still watch it, though few now remember it was once a goddess who descended to death and returned, who wore the morning and evening as her dual aspects, who embodied the fierce truth that desire and violence are not opposites but twins, that creation and destruction move together in cycles we witness but cannot fully control. The gods were learning, through Inanna's example, that ambition could be pursued, that cosmic order was not as fixed as Enlil claimed, that those willing to risk catastrophe might gain power, that hierarchy would never grant them. This lesson would not be forgotten. Other gods would follow Inanna's example, each in their own way, until the conflicts escalated beyond negotiation, beyond compromise, into open warfare that would shake the foundations of heaven and earth. For nearly 2,000 years, the religious center of Mesopotamia had been Nippur, Enlil's city, the place where divine assemblies convened and cosmic fates were decreed. But around 1800 BCE, political power shifted dramatically. Babylon, previously a minor city on the Euphrates, rose under the Amorite dynasty to dominate southern Mesopotamia, and Babylon's patron god Marduk demanded theological supremacy to match his city's political ascendancy. This created an unprecedented problem. The divine hierarchy was supposed to be eternal, established at creation, unchanging as the stars. Anu ruled heaven, Enlil governed earth and air, Enki controlled the waters. These were cosmic facts, not subject to political revision. Yet here was Babylon, clearly the dominant military and economic power, insisting its god deserved recognition as supreme, as king of the gods, as holder of the tablet of destinies. The solution was theological revolution disguised as ancient revelation. Babylonian priests composed the Enuma Elish, the creation epic we have discussed already, but now we examine its political purpose. The text claims to describe primordial events, creation's actual unfolding, but scholars recognize it as sophisticated propaganda, mythology rewritten to justify contemporary power structures. The Enuma Elish begins before creation, with only Apsu, fresh water, and Tiamat, salt water, existing, their waters mingling to produce the first generation of gods. These younger gods become noisy and disturbing, leading Apsu to propose destroying them. Tiamat initially resists this plan, but when Ea, the Babylonian name for Enki, discovers the plot and kills Apsu in self-defense, Tiamat becomes enraged. She creates an army of monsters and elevates Kingu, her new consort, to lead them in war against the younger gods. The younger gods are terrified. None of them can stand against Tiamat's fury. In desperation, they turn to Marduk, son of Ea, who agrees to fight Tiamat on one condition. If he defeats her, he must be elevated to kingship over all gods, his word becoming law, his authority absolute. The gods accept these terms. They grant him the tablet of destinies, give him powerful weapons, and Marduk goes forth to battle. The combat is cosmic in scale. Marduk captures Tiamat in a net, drives winds into her belly until she inflates like a bloated carcass, then shoots an arrow down her throat that pierces her heart. He splits her body, using half to create the sky above and half to form the earth below. From Kingu's blood mixed with clay, he fashions humanity to serve the gods, and the grateful gods build Marduk a temple in Babylon, the Esagila, proclaiming him supreme ruler for delivering them from chaos. This myth serves multiple purposes simultaneously. It explains creation, providing Babylonian versions of cosmogony and anthropogony. It justifies Marduk's elevation over older Sumerian deities, and Enlil and Enki now appear as supporting characters rather than supreme authorities, and it establishes Babylon as cosmic center, the place where kingship among gods was decided, where humanity was created, where order was established. But notice what the myth requires. The older gods must willingly surrender their authority, must acknowledge Marduk's supremacy, because he accomplished what they could not. This was not conquest through violence alone, but legitimation through demonstrated capability. Marduk earned his position by saving divine society from existential threat. The political message was clear. Babylon deserves dominance because it provides security that older cities cannot. Evidence for how this theological revolution was implemented comes from later historical records. King Hammurabi, who ruled Babylon from 1792 to 1750 BCE, conquered most of Mesopotamia during his reign, defeating the armies of Larsa, Eshnunna, Mari, and other rival cities. His famous law code, inscribed on a diorite stele now in the Louvre, begins with a prologue crediting Marduk with granting him kingship and justice. The text describes Anu and Enlil as calling Marduk to supremacy, as designating Babylon for greatness. This represents not just political change but theological engineering. The old gods were not discarded. That would be too revolutionary, too destabilizing. Instead, they were subordinated, recontextualized within a hierarchy that placed Marduk at the apex. Enlil's titles and functions were transferred to Marduk. The Tablet of Destinies, previously held by Enlil, now belonged to Marduk. Divine assemblies that once met at Nippur now convened in Babylon. How did the old religious establishments respond? The archaeological record suggests a negotiation rather than outright resistance. Nippur continued functioning as religious center, though reduced in importance. Temple archives show Babylon's kings providing substantial offerings to Enlil's shrine, maintaining the appearance of continuity even as real power shifted. This was compromise, face-saving incorporation of older tradition into new political reality. But calling this process peaceful would be misleading. Hammurabi's military campaigns devastated cities that resisted Babylon's dominance. His year names, the titles by which each year of his reign was later remembered, celebrate specific conquests. Year in which Hammurabi the king destroyed the army of Elam, year in which the wall of the land was built. Behind the theological poetry of gods willingly elevating Marduk lay military force compelling submission. The Enuma Elish was recited annually during Babylon's New Year festival, the Akitu, a 12-day ceremony renewing the cosmos and the king's authority. On the fourth day, priests chanted the complete epic, all 7 tablets, reminding attendees of Marduk's victory over chaos, of his creation of order, of his rightful supremacy. The king's role in the ceremony involved ritually humbling himself before Marduk's statue, having his royal insignia temporarily removed, being struck on the cheek by the high priest, then having his authority restored after affirming his proper service to the god. This ritual subordination of earthly king to divine king reinforced the hierarchy, Marduk above all, the human king as Marduk's representative, the people serving both. But it also revealed anxiety, the need to continually re-establish legitimacy through performed submission, to demonstrate that power derived from divine authority rather than mere force. Standing in modern Baghdad, looking toward the ruins of ancient Babylon, roughly 80 kilometers south, you can barely conceive the city's former glory. Alexander the Great died there in 323 BCE in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar II, planning to make Babylon his eastern capital. The Hanging Gardens, if they existed as described, would have been one of the ancient world's wonders. The Ishtar Gate, reconstructed in Berlin's Pergamon Museum from original bricks, excavated by German archaeologists, displays the artistic sophistication, glazed blue tiles decorated with lions, dragons, and bulls in relief, each animal representing different deities. But beneath the artistic achievement and political power lay theological violence. Marduk's rise required diminishing gods who had been worshipped for millennia. It required rewriting creation myths, subordinating older traditions, compelling temple establishments to accept new hierarchy. This was divine civil war fought through literature and ritual, rather than on battlefield, but war nonetheless, a struggle for supremacy, for control of cosmic narrative, for the authority to define which gods mattered, and which would fade into secondary status. The pattern established by Marduk's elevation would repeat throughout ancient Near Eastern history. When Assyria dominated the region, its national god Ashur was elevated similarly. When Persia conquered Babylon, Ahura Mazda was proclaimed supreme. Each empire required theological justification, divine approval for earthly dominance. And each time, older gods were demoted, subordinated, or absorbed into new hierarchies that reflected political realities disguised as eternal cosmic truth. The gods were at war, not always with weapons but with narratives, with ritual, with the power to define reality through story and ceremony, and humanity, watching these struggles play out in temple politics and priestly negotiations, learned that even divine order was subject to revision when power demanded it. Around 800 BCE, perhaps during or shortly after a period of plague and warfare in Babylonia, a poet composed one of the most unsettling texts in Mesopotamian literature, the Era epic. Unlike other myths set in primordial time, this one described recent or contemporary catastrophe, theological explanation for suffering that exceeded normal bounds of divine punishment. Era, also known as Nergal, was god of plague, warfare, and the underworld, not in the sense of judging the dead like his consort Ereshkigal, but as bringer of mass death that filled the underworld with victims. He was necessary within the pantheon. Someone had to govern warfare's violence and disease's devastation, but he was dangerous, his nature fundamentally destructive. The epic begins with Era restless, his weapons rusting from disuse, his warrior nature frustrated by peace. His minister Ishum, attempting to mollify him, suggests Era's weapons need refurbishing. This gives Era an idea. Convince Marduk to leave Babylon temporarily, claiming the king of gods needs to have his regalia cleaned and repaired. Once Marduk departs, Era will have freedom to act. Marduk is skeptical. He knows that his presence maintains cosmic order, that his absence could invite chaos, but Era manipulates him, suggesting his appearance has become shabby, that the gods are noticing his diminished splendor. Marduk, concerned for his dignity, agrees to leave temporarily while his regalia is restored. This decision, made from vanity rather than wisdom, creates the opening Era needs. With Marduk gone, Era unleashes violence upon Babylon and surrounding territories, but crucially, this is not limited, proportional punishment for specific transgressions. Era's violence spirals into indiscriminate slaughter. He attacks the righteous alongside the wicked. He targets children, elderly, people performing correct rituals. His fury becomes self-perpetuating, destruction for its own sake, divine nature corrupted by its own darkness, until nothing restrains it. The text describes consequences in horrifying detail. The son does not inquire after the health of his father. The father does not care for his son. The mother plots evil against her daughter. Social bonds dissolve. Cities burn. Fields lie fallow. Commerce stops. The infrastructure of civilization, both physical and social, collapses under sustained violence that no longer serves any corrective purpose. Ishum, Era's own minister, begins to recognize the catastrophe exceeding any justifiable limits. He confronts Era, essentially arguing that the god has lost control, that his actions now threaten the very order he was supposed to maintain through selective violence. The epic portrays this as intervention, one deity attempting to restore another's reason before irreversible damage occurs. Gradually, Era's fury exhausts itself. He returns to awareness of what he has done, the devastation inflicted. The text does not portray him as repentant exactly, but as recognizing that even his destructive nature has limits beyond which exercise of power becomes self-defeating. Marduk returns to Babylon. Order is slowly restored, but the damage cannot be fully undone. The cities burned will take generations to rebuild. The dead cannot be recalled to life. What makes the Era epic so theologically challenging is its admission that divine nature itself can become corrupted, that gods are not immune to being consumed by their own destructive tendencies. Era was created as plague god, warfare god, the divine function of violence, but that function, given free rein, became madness. The text suggests that even necessary violence requires restraint, that without limits enforced by other gods or by the violent deity's own recognition of consequences, destruction serves no purpose but destruction. Scholars debate what historical events inspired this text. Some point to plague outbreaks recorded in Neo-Assyrian letters, diseases that devastated cities despite proper propitiation of gods. Others suggest warfare, perhaps Assyrian military campaigns that destroyed Babylonian cities in conflicts over imperial control. The Era epic may have been composed as theological response to Babylon's suffering under Assyrian domination, explaining catastrophe through divine madness, rather than admitting military defeat or political subjugation. But the text transcends its specific historical context by exploring something universal. What happens when power, even divine power, operates without wisdom or restraint? Era was not evil in the sense of pursuing wickedness. He was fulfilling his nature as destroyer. But nature untempered by reason, violence unguided by justice, leads inevitably to outcomes that serve no one, not even the violent actor. The epic ends with Era proclaiming that the text itself, the poem describing his madness and its consequences, should be preserved and recited. Anyone who learns and teaches this story will be protected from plague and warfare. This metatextual element suggests the composition's purpose, not just to explain past suffering but to prevent future catastrophe, by reminding listeners that even gods can lose themselves to darkness, that recognizing and naming that tendency is crucial to avoiding its repetition. Think about what this myth says about divine nature. The Anunnaki were not portrayed as perfectly good, as beings of pure benevolence. They possessed dangerous qualities: Era's violence, Inanna's ambition, Enlil's wrath, Enki's cunning. These qualities were necessary for governing a creation that contained both order and chaos, both life and death, both fertility and barrenness. But each quality carried risk of excess, potential to spiral beyond proper bounds into something destructive rather than regulatory. The civil wars among the Anunnaki, then, were not aberrations but consequences of their complex natures. Gods who embodied violence would sometimes turn that violence against other gods. Gods who sought power would scheme for supremacy. Gods who enforced order would clash with gods who preferred flexibility. And humanity, caught between warring deities, would suffer from conflicts we did not create and could not prevent. The era epic circulated widely in the first millennium BCE, copied and recopied, learned by scribal students, recited as both literature and protective charm. It remains one of the most psychologically sophisticated texts from ancient Mesopotamia, exploring divine psychology in ways that acknowledge darkness, madness, the corruption that can consume even cosmic forces when their essential natures operate without limit. Above Babylon, the stars continued their measured wheel, indifferent to whether gods maintained reason or succumbed to fury. And below, humans pressed this story into clay, teaching each generation that power unchecked becomes madness, that violence unrestrained serves no purpose but devastation, that even gods need other gods to prevent them from destroying what they were meant to protect. The conflicts were escalating, moving from philosophical disagreements towards something closer to open warfare. We will see next how these divine battles were understood through astronomical observations, how the heavens themselves became battlefield, where gods fought in forms humans could observe and record. The ancient Mesopotamians watched the night sky with attention that modern urban dwellers can barely imagine. Without electric light, without atmospheric pollution, the stars appeared in their full glory. The Milky Way, a river of pale light overhead, planets clearly visible as wandering points of brilliance, moving against the fixed constellations, meteor showers and comets, arriving as dramatic disruptions of celestial order. These observations were not casual stargazing, but systematic astronomical science. The Muldot pin tablets, compiled around 1000 BCE, but preserving knowledge accumulated over centuries, catalogue over 60 stars and constellations, document the heliacal rising of stars throughout the year, track planetary movements, calculate solstices and equinoxes with impressive precision. The tablets describe how to use stellar observations to determine agricultural timing, when to plant barley based on which stars appeared on the eastern horizon at dawn, when to expect floods based on celestial configurations. But beyond practical applications, the Mesopotamians saw theological significance in celestial mechanics. Each major deity corresponded to a heavenly body: Shamash the sun, Sin, or Nana the moon, Inanna or Ishtar, identified with Venus, Marduk with Jupiter, Ninurta with Saturn, Nabu with Mercury, Nergal with Mars. These were not mere symbolic associations, but understood as the gods' physical manifestations, their presence visible in the night sky, even when they resided in distant temples on Earth. When planets moved in unusual patterns, this required theological explanation. Venus displays particularly dramatic behavior, appearing as morning star for several months, then disappearing during inferior conjunction with the Sun, reappearing as evening star, vanishing again during superior conjunction, a cycle repeating roughly every 584 days. The Mesopotamians tracked these Venus cycles obsessively, recording them on tablets that show centuries of accumulated observations. The Venus tablet of Amasiduqa, dating to approximately 1650 BCE, documents 21 years of Venus observations during the reign of King Amasiduqa of Babylon's first dynasty. The text records specific dates when Venus appeared on the eastern horizon before dawn, when it disappeared, when it reappeared in the west after sunset, correlating these celestial events with earthly occurrences, good harvests, military victories, floods, plagues. The underlying assumption was clear. Venus movements influenced or predicted earthly events because Venus was Inanna, and Inanna's actions in the divine realm manifested simultaneously in both heaven and earth. Consider what this meant for understanding divine warfare. When Mars, identified with Nergal the war god, moved into close conjunction with another planet, this was interpreted as Nergal approaching that deity for conflict or negotiation. When Venus underwent retrograde motion, appearing to reverse direction against the background stars, this suggested Inanna's plans changing, her attention shifting, possibly her retreating from some cosmic confrontation. The battles described in mythology were not confined to invisible spiritual realms, but were believed to play out in observable celestial mechanics. Modern astronomy explains these movements through gravitational physics, orbital mechanics following Kepler's laws. Venus's retrograde motion results from Earth and Venus orbiting the Sun at different speeds, creating the illusion of backward movement when viewed from Earth's perspective. Mars's approach to other planets is geometric coincidence, objects at vastly different distances appearing close only from our particular vantage point. But perhaps the ancient astronomers were not entirely wrong to see pattern and meaning in celestial mechanics, not because gods literally inhabit planets, but because watching the sky teaches humility before vast scales of time and space. The planets follow patterns that span years or decades, cycles that dwarf human lifespans yet remain mathematically predictable across centuries. This suggests order regularity, something that transcends human chaos and continues regardless of whether civilizations rise or fall. The Enuma Elish, Babylon's creation epic, contains an astronomical dimension often overlooked in theological analysis. After Marduk defeats Tiamat and creates the cosmos from her corpse, he establishes the stars as stations for the great gods, creates the zodiacal constellations as markers of the year, sets the moon in motion to mark months, assigns the sun its daily path. This is cosmogony that explicitly incorporates astronomical ordering, creation understood as establishment of celestial regularity. Some scholars argue the Enuma Elish encodes actual astronomical observations. The battle between Marduk and Tiamat, they suggest, might represent the triumph of observable order, planetary motions following mathematical patterns over primordial chaos, the unpredictable void before systematic observation began. Marduk's elevation to kingship coincides with Jupiter's prominence in Babylonian astronomy, the planet whose 12-year orbital period made it useful for long-term timekeeping. Alternative interpretations push further, suggesting ancient astronomical knowledge exceeded what mainstream scholarship acknowledges. Some researchers point to the precision of Mesopotamian calculations, their ability to predict lunar eclipses, their sophisticated mathematical systems using base 60 arithmetic that we still use for measuring time and angles. How did Bronze Age astronomers, working without telescopes, without precise mechanical clocks, achieve such accuracy? The standard scholarly answer emphasizes centuries of accumulated observations, patient record-keeping across generations, mathematical sophistication developed for administrative purposes and applied to celestial phenomena. Temple scribes tracked Venus cycles for decades, compiled the data, recognized patterns, developed predictive models. This required no supernatural knowledge, only dedication and mathematical literacy. But the alternative view asks whether cultural memory might preserve echoes of knowledge from even earlier sources, whether the Sumerians inherited astronomical understanding from predecessors whose names we've lost. The Sumerian king list speaks of kingship descending from heaven before the flood, of cities ruled for impossible lengths of time, suggesting mythologized memory of extremely ancient settlements. Could astronomical knowledge also have deeper roots than we can currently trace? These questions remain genuinely open. Archaeological discoveries continually push back the timeline of human sophistication. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, constructed around 9500 BCE, demonstrates that hunter-gatherers created monumental architecture millennia before agriculture supposedly made such projects possible. The site's stone pillars may encode astronomical observations, though interpreting their symbolism remains contentious. If people built such structures 11,000 years ago, what knowledge might they have accumulated and transmitted? Standing beneath a dark sky far from modern light pollution, you can begin to understand the ancient relationship with celestial mechanics. The planets are immediately visible, not as tiny points requiring effort to locate, but as bright beacons impossible to miss. Venus at maximum brilliance casts visible shadows. Jupiter outshines everything except Venus, the Moon and the Sun. Mars during close approach glows distinctly red, its color alone suggesting association with blood, war, violence. Watching these planets move across weeks and months, you would naturally begin to recognize patterns. Venus always appears near the Sun, never opposite it. Mars brightens and dims according to a roughly 2-year cycle. Jupiter marches steadily through the zodiac, spending about a year in each constellation. These patterns beg for explanation, for understanding what drives them, what they might mean. The Mesopotamians explained them through divine action and interaction. Modern science explains them through physics and geometry. Both explanations attempt to impose order on observation, to find meaning in pattern. Perhaps the ancient astronomers' error was not in seeking meaning, but in assuming that meaning must be personal, that celestial movements revealed divine intentions rather than physical laws. Or perhaps the distinction between physical law and divine intention was never as clear as we assume. If gods created the cosmos, why wouldn't their nature be expressed through the very laws by which creation operates? Why separate divine will from mathematical regularity, when both describe patterns that persist across time? The tablets recording astronomical observations still exist, still preserve their data accurately enough that modern astronomers can use them to study historical celestial events. And the myths describing gods at war still resonate, still capture something true about power, conflict, the struggle for dominance that plays out in human affairs, regardless of whether gods literally battle in heaven. The sky continues its measured dance, planets moving through their ordained paths, apparently unconcerned with whether we understand them as divine actors or gravitational consequences. The mystery is not which interpretation is correct, but why humans need interpretation at all, why we cannot rest content with observation, but must always ask what it means, what purposes drive the patterns we witness. Modern archaeological techniques reveal layers of meaning beneath ancient structures that surface examination could never detect. Ground-penetrating radar mapping temple foundations without excavation, showing construction phases and hidden chambers. Laser scanning creating millimeter-precise 3D models that reveal architectural patterns invisible to the naked eye. Chemical analysis of residues on pottery and altars identifying specific substances used in rituals. Date wine, cedar oil, fatty deposits suggesting animal sacrifice. These technologies are uncovering surprising sophistication in how Mesopotamian temples were designed and used. At Eridu, excavations revealed 17 successive temple levels, each built directly atop the previous one's ruins, maintaining continuous sacred space for nearly 5,000 years. The earliest temples, from around 5400 BCE, were simple single-room structures barely larger than modern garden sheds. But even these primitive buildings displayed intentional orientation, doorways facing east toward the rising sun, altars positioned at the western end where priests would stand facing the light. As temples grew larger and more architecturally complex, their designs incorporated increasingly sophisticated elements. The ziggurat at Ur, constructed around 2100 BCE, uses 3 different mud brick sizes in its core: larger bricks for foundational courses, medium bricks for the bulk of the structure, smaller bricks near the top to reduce weight. The outer facing employed baked bricks set in bitumen mortar, creating a waterproof shell protecting the sun-dried core from erosion. Weep holes, small openings angled downward through the facing, allowed moisture trapped in the core to escape rather than freeze and crack the structure. This demonstrates engineering knowledge based on centuries of trial and error, understanding gained from watching earlier temples deteriorate, and determining what construction methods prevented premature collapse. The technology was not mysterious or lost, but represents accumulated expertise, passed from master builders to apprentices, across generations. Yet certain aspects of temple construction and use remain genuinely puzzling. At several sites including Nippur and Uruk, archaeologists discovered elaborate underground drainage systems extending beneath temple platforms, far more complex than necessary for simple water management. These tunnels and channels are corbel-vaulted, precisely angled to maintain flow without requiring external energy, connecting to deep wells and surface channels in networks that required significant engineering to plan and construct. What purpose did these systems serve? The practical explanation suggests waste removal, keeping ritual purity by channeling away blood and fluids from sacrifices, maintaining clean water supplies separate from contamination. But the system's complexity exceeds utilitarian needs. Some channels lead to dead ends, or loop back on themselves. Some connect to chambers that show no evidence of practical function. Spaces too small to serve as storage, too inaccessible to be regularly used by priests. Alternative interpretations suggest ritual significance, that water flowing beneath the temple represented the Abzu, the subterranean freshwater ocean over which Enki presided. Perhaps priests conducted secret ceremonies in these underground spaces, initiations or mystery rites not recorded in administrative texts, because they were restricted knowledge, taught orally to select individuals rather than documented on clay tablets, accessible to any literate scribe. Evidence for such secret practices appears occasionally in fragmentary references. Certain texts mention things not to be seen by the uninitiated, rituals performed behind closed doors in temple inner chambers. The Mesopotamian concept of secret of the gods, knowledge restricted to priesthood, suggests not all religious practice was public ceremony. Some wisdom was deliberately withheld, protected from profane understanding. Modern excavations occasionally uncover artifacts that resist easy explanation. In 1936, archaeologists working near Baghdad discovered the Baghdad Battery, a ceramic jar containing a copper cylinder and iron rod, dated to approximately 250 BCE during the Parthian period. When similar constructions are filled with acidic liquid like vinegar or wine, they generate roughly 1.1 volts of electrical current. Some researchers argue this demonstrates ancient understanding of electrochemistry, possibly used for electroplating gold onto silver objects, a technique that would explain the uniform, thin gold layers seen on certain artifacts. Mainstream archaeology remains skeptical, pointing out that no ancient texts describe such technology, that the interpretation requires assuming knowledge that appears nowhere else in the historical record, that simpler explanations exist for the gold layering techniques. The debate continues, neither side able to definitively prove their interpretation. Similar uncertainty surrounds the Mi, those divine powers Inanna stole from Enki, which myths describe as physical objects carried in boats, yet also as cosmic principles governing civilizations' functions, were the mere metaphorical, abstract concepts personified for mythological purposes, or did they represent actual artifacts, perhaps tablets inscribed with knowledge and instructions, templates for organizing society that could be physically transported from one city to another? We cannot know. The texts describe the me in ways that suggest both material reality and abstract principle simultaneously. Enki keeps them in his temple at Eridu, implying physical storage, but they also include things like godship and kingship and the art of lovemaking, concepts that cannot be reduced to physical objects. Perhaps this very ambiguity was intentional, a way of expressing that certain knowledge exists in liminal space between physical and metaphysical, that not everything can be categorized cleanly as either material object or pure idea. Acoustic archaeologists studying temple architecture have discovered that many chambers display unusual sonic properties. At Nippur-Zekur, the main shrine chamber amplifies frequencies around 110 Hz, the approximate pitch of a male voice intoning deeply, while damping higher frequencies that would carry conversational speech. This creates an environment where chanted prayers seem to emanate from everywhere at once, surrounding the listener, while normal conversation becomes muffled and difficult. Was this intentional design, architecture serving theological purpose by making ritual more impressive and mysterious? Testing suggests it was. Computer modeling shows the acoustic properties result from specific ratios of room dimensions, ceiling heights, wall thicknesses, materials used. Changing any of these parameters significantly alters the acoustic profile. The builders, whether through intentional calculation or refined intuition based on observing earlier temples, created spaces that enhanced ritual performance through architectural acoustics. This demonstrates sophisticated knowledge without requiring supernatural explanation. Ancient builders understood that sound behaved predictably, that certain architectural choices produced desirable sonic effects, that temples could be designed to create specific sensory experiences supporting religious function. The technology was empirical, based on observation and refinement, entirely within human capability, but it also reveals that ancient worship engaged multiple senses in carefully orchestrated ways. Modern people encountering Mesopotamian myths as texts, as words on pages or tablets, miss the full embodied experience. Chanted prayers in acoustically designed chambers, incense smoke filling spaces, flickering oil lamps creating moving shadows, physical prostration before divine statues, processions through streets where entire populations witnessed theological narratives, performed as living drama. The gods existed not just in written mythology, but in sensory reality, present in spaces designed to manifest their power through architecture, ritual, carefully controlled symbolic action. When priests described divine battles, they were not conveying abstract theology, but invoking experiences, memories of ceremonies where divine conflict was made tangible through performed narrative, where participants felt the reality of cosmic struggle, even if they understood it partly as metaphor, partly as something deeper than literal combat, yet more real than fiction. Beneath the ruined temples, beneath the silt deposited by 4 millennia of seasonal flooding, beneath modern water tables that have risen and complicated excavation, there remain chambers never fully explored, archives catalogued but not translated, artifacts analyzed but not understood. What knowledge rests there waiting? What practices went unrecorded because literacy served administration rather than preserving secret wisdom? We work with what has survived, the texts that priests chose to preserve, the structures that resisted erosion, the artifacts durable enough to reach us across impossible spans of time. But what we have represents a tiny fraction of what existed, what was known, what Mesopotamians understood about their world, and the divine forces they believed governed it. The silence beneath temples holds its mysteries close, patient across centuries, content to wait until perhaps more sophisticated techniques reveal what remains hidden, or until scholars learn to read what is already exposed but not yet understood. The question persists across academic conferences and alternative research circles, debated with equal passion, though often with radically different methodologies. Who or what were the Anunnaki? The texts themselves provide no simple answer, offering descriptions that range from clearly mythological to surprisingly specific, from obviously symbolic to ambiguously literal. Mainstream Mesopotamian scholarship interprets the Anunnaki as mythological constructs, gods invented by ancient peoples to explain natural phenomena, personifications of cosmic forces, theological expressions of political and social structures. This view emphasizes how gods represented cities, their conflicts mirroring earthly political struggles between competing urban centers. When myths describe Enlil and Enki at odds, they reflect tensions between Nippur's religious authority and Eridu's claim to primacy as civilization's origin point. The evidence supporting this interpretation is substantial. Texts explicitly state that gods owned cities, that temples were divine households, that priests acted as administrators managing divine property. Archaeological excavations confirm temples functioned as economic centers, controlling vast agricultural estates, workshops, trade networks. The system makes sense as theocratic governance, religious institutions wielding political and economic power justified through theology. But certain textual elements resist purely symbolic interpretation. The Anunnaki are consistently described as having come from somewhere, as descending to earth from heaven. The term itself, Anunnaki, offspring of Anu, suggests lineage, familial relationship, beings who originated elsewhere before establishing presence in Mesopotamia. Some myths specify that 50 Anunnaki descended, exactly 50, a number that appears repeatedly in contexts suggesting precision, rather than symbolic approximation. The ancient astronaut hypothesis, popularized in the 1960s and 70s by writers like Zecharia Sitchin, proposes that Anunnaki were extraterrestrial visitors whose technological capabilities were mythologized by Bronze Age witnesses into divine powers. This interpretation points to descriptions of divine flying boats, weapons that shine and thunder, the Mia's advanced devices or databases, Anunnaki depicted in art with unusual headgear that might represent helmets or breathing apparatus. Scholars overwhelmingly reject this interpretation, citing multiple methodological problems. Sitchin's translations of cuneiform texts contain demonstrable errors, mistranslations where proper reading yields conventional meanings rather than supporting his extraterrestrial thesis. The artifacts he cites as evidence of ancient technology can be explained through conventional archaeology without invoking interplanetary contact, and the entire framework requires ignoring how mythology functions across cultures, the universal human tendency to personify natural forces and create narratives explaining existence. Yet the hypothesis persists in popular culture, resonating with audiences who find something compelling in the possibility that humanity's origins might involve contact with advanced civilizations, that gods might represent distorted memories of actual encounters. Why does this interpretation appeal despite scholarly refutation? Perhaps because the conventional explanation, while academically sound, feels reductive. To say the Anunnaki were just myths seems to dismiss the intensity with which ancient peoples believed in and experienced these beings. The Mesopotamians were not primitive or ignorant. They developed mathematics, astronomy, architecture, literature, legal codes, agricultural techniques, metallurgy. They created one of humanity's first great civilizations. Would such sophisticated people believe in gods without any experiential basis for that belief? The middle ground, rarely explored because it satisfies neither conventional scholarship nor alternative researchers, suggests the Anunnaki functioned as real psychological and sociological forces, even if not physically present as the myths describe. Gods existed in the collective consciousness, shaping behavior, providing frameworks for understanding experience, creating shared reality that influenced how people acted and how societies organized themselves. From this perspective, asking whether gods were real misses the point. They were real in their effects, in the temples built to house them, in the wars fought over them, in the laws proclaimed in their names, in the millions of lives shaped by belief in their power. Whether they also existed as independent entities beyond human imagination becomes secondary to recognizing their impact on human history. Linguistic analysis provides another angle of investigation. The Sumerian language, as mentioned earlier, is a linguistic isolate, unrelated to any known language family. Its structure operates differently from Semitic languages like Akkadian, Hebrew, or Arabic, differently from Indo-European languages, differently from any other documented linguistic system. Where did Sumerian come from? The conventional answer notes that language isolates exist worldwide, that not all languages must be traceable to common roots, that Sumerian developed in Mesopotamia from earlier pre-linguistic communication, whose specifics are lost to prehistory. But the strangeness of Sumerian, its unique grammatical structures and vocabulary, has led some researchers to speculate it might represent contact language, perhaps influenced by speakers of a now-lost language from elsewhere. This speculation remains unprovable. Linguistic evidence insufficient to determine whether Sumerian evolved in isolation or incorporated influences from sources we cannot identify. But it adds to the sense of mystery surrounding Mesopotamian civilization, the feeling that something unusual occurred there in the 4th millennium BCE, when writing, cities, complex administration, all emerged in relatively rapid succession. The astronomical precision of Mesopotamian observations, discussed earlier, adds another dimension. They tracked planetary cycles spanning decades, compiled data across centuries, developed predictive models that worked. Some alternative researchers argue this suggests either extremely ancient observational tradition extending back millennia before writing, or knowledge transmitted from sources with longer historical perspective than conventional timelines allow. Mainstream astronomy counters that given clear skies, patient observation, and mathematical sophistication, Bronze Age astronomers could achieve everything the tablets demonstrate. The calculations are impressive, but not impossible, remarkable, but not supernatural. They represent human capacity for systematic observation and mathematical reasoning applied consistently across generations. What unites both conventional and alternative interpretations is recognition that something extraordinary happened in ancient Mesopotamia. Civilization emerged from scattered agricultural villages into complex urban societies, with writing, law, monumental architecture, sophisticated arts and sciences, all within a relatively compressed timeframe. Whether this resulted from purely human innovation, from cultural transmission from earlier unknown sources, or from contact with non-human intelligences, the achievement remains astonishing. The gods watched over this development, or at least the people believed they did, and that belief shaped everything: where cities were built, how resources were allocated, which innovations were pursued, how conflicts were resolved or escalated into warfare. The Anunnaki, whatever their ontological status, served as organizing principles for civilization, frameworks within which human potential could be directed toward collective achievement. Standing in modern museums, looking at clay tablets whose wedge-shaped marks preserve divine names and mythological narratives, you confront the unbridgeable distance between then and now. We read the myths as literature, as historical documents, as data points for academic analysis. They experienced these stories as revelation, as explanation, as connection to forces that governed existence at levels beyond human control. Which perspective is correct? Perhaps both, perhaps neither. Perhaps the question itself reveals modern bias, the assumption that clear categorization into real or mythological exhausts the possibilities for how beings like the Anunnaki might exist. The texts remain, the myths persist, the questions endure, and the gods, whether they were extraterrestrial visitors, psychological projections, political constructs, or something else entirely, continue speaking through tablets pressed in clay, their wars and conflicts and struggles for supremacy, preserved in wedge-shaped marks that have outlasted empires, outlasted the civilization that created them, reaching across 4 millennia to ask us what we believe about power, about divinity, about the forces that shape human destiny. Some mysteries resist solution not because evidence is lacking, but because the categories we bring to investigation fail to capture the full complexity of what ancient peoples expressed. The Anunnaki may be one such mystery, real enough to have shaped history, elusive enough to resist final explanation, persistent enough to continue provoking wonder in everyone who encounters their stories and asks what truth might lie beneath mythology's surface. The tablets offer descriptions that simultaneously clarify and confuse. The Anunnaki were judges in the underworld, 7 divine beings who decreed the fates of the dead. They were the great gods who governed cosmic affairs, meeting in assembly at Enlil's temple in Nippur. They were the offspring of Anu, the sky god, descended from heaven to earth. They numbered 50 in some traditions, 7 in others, hundreds in texts that list lesser divine functionaries. Each description appears in context, suggesting the scribes who wrote them believed they were documenting reality, not composing fiction. Academic scholarship approaches these texts as mythology, sophisticated theological literature, created by literate priesthoods to explain natural phenomena, justify political structures, and provide cosmological frameworks for understanding existence. This interpretation emphasizes parallels with other ancient mythological systems. The Greek Titans and Olympians fought for cosmic supremacy. Norse mythology describes the Aesir and Vanir at war. Egyptian gods engaged in conflicts that echoed political struggles between Upper and Lower Egypt. Every complex civilization developed pantheons, whose conflicts mirrored human social tensions, whose powers corresponded to natural forces, whose stories explained why the world operated as it did. From this perspective, the Anunnaki civil wars represent theological processing of political realities. When Babylon conquered southern Mesopotamia, Marduk's elevation reflected earthly power shifts. When cities competed for resources, their patron deities fought in mythological parallel. The flood narratives encoded cultural memory of devastating inundations that occurred periodically in low-lying Mesopotamian plains. Divine conflicts were metaphors, sophisticated ones requiring literacy and abstract thinking to compose, but metaphors nonetheless. The evidence supporting this interpretation is substantial, and methodologically sound. Cuneiform tablets correlate divine favor with military victory, divine anger with natural disasters, divine assembly decisions with political changes affecting multiple cities. The system makes sense as ancient peoples attempting to impose order on chaotic experience, to find patterns in events that seemed beyond human control, to establish frameworks for predicting and influencing outcomes through ritual propitiation of powerful beings. But certain textual elements resist purely metaphorical reading. The specificity troubles the neat categorization. The Atrahasis epic describes exact dimensions for the ark: length, width, height, number of decks, the pitch coating required for waterproofing. Why include engineering specifications in a flood myth if the story is purely symbolic? The Enuma Elish details Marduk's weapons: the bow, the mace, the lightning bolt, the net, the 4 winds he captures and directs against Tiamat. Symbolic narrative requires less precision than these texts provide. Some researchers, examining the same evidence, propose alternative interpretations. Perhaps the myths preserve distorted memories of actual beings who possessed advanced knowledge or technology, visitors from elsewhere whose capabilities seem divine to Bronze Age witnesses. This hypothesis points to descriptions that sound oddly technological: divine flying boats that travel between Earth and the Abzu, weapons that shine and thunder, the me as physical objects carrying encoded information, references to gods wearing radiant garments that might represent protective equipment or luminous materials. Zechariah Sitchin popularized this interpretation in the 1970s, arguing that cuneiform texts, properly translated, described extraterrestrial colonists who genetically engineered humans as a labor force. His work generated enormous popular interest, but virtually universal academic rejection. Scholars demonstrated that his translations contained significant errors, that his interpretations required ignoring conventional meanings of Sumerian and Akkadian terms, that the entire framework rested on selective reading, that emphasized passages supporting his thesis while dismissing contradictory evidence. Yet the hypothesis persists in popular consciousness, resonating with audiences who find something compelling in the possibility that humanity's origins involve contact with advanced civilizations. Why does this interpretation endure despite scholarly refutation? Perhaps because it addresses intuitions that conventional explanations leave unsatisfied. The Mesopotamians were sophisticated. They developed mathematics using base 60 arithmetic that we still employ for measuring time and angles. They tracked Venus cycles across decades, predicting eclipses, mapping stellar coordinates. They engineered irrigation systems managing water across vast territories, constructed monumental architecture that has survived 4 millennia. Would such accomplished people maintain beliefs about divine visitors without experiential basis? The question contains assumptions worth examining. We presume that technological sophistication correlates with accurate cosmological understanding, that people capable of astronomical calculation would not believe in physically present gods, but this presumes our current worldview represents objective reality rather than one interpretive framework among many possible ones. Ancient Mesopotamians might have been both technologically sophisticated and correct about divine presence, if gods existed in forms we no longer recognize or acknowledge. A third perspective, less common than either conventional scholarship or alternative interpretations, suggests the Anunnaki functioned as real psychological and sociological forces regardless of their ontological status. Gods existed in collective consciousness, shaping behavior, providing frameworks for understanding experience, creating shared reality that influenced actions and social organization. From this view, asking whether gods were physically real misses the point. They were real in their effects: temples built to house them, wars fought over them, laws proclaimed in their names, millions of lives shaped by belief in their power. This interpretation allows for both metaphorical and literal dimensions simultaneously. The gods were psychological constructs, and they shaped material reality through human behavior, and ancient peoples experienced them as independently existing beings. Multiple levels of reality coexist: subjective experience, collective belief, physical outcomes resulting from that belief. The categories we bring to analysis, the distinction between real and imaginary, may be insufficient for understanding how ancient peoples experienced divine presence. Cross-cultural patterns add complexity to the question. Flood myths appear across unconnected civilizations: Mesopotamian, Hebrew, Greek, Hindu, Native American, Aboriginal Australian. Some scholars explain this through universal human experience of catastrophic flooding, stories arising independently as populations settled river valleys prone to inundation. Others suggest cultural diffusion, myths spreading through trade and migration from a single origin point. A few researchers propose the myths preserve memory of actual global or near-global catastrophe, perhaps rapid sea level rise at the end of the last ice age, which submerged coastal settlements worldwide between 12,000 and 8,000 BCE. Each explanation has merit. Each accounts for certain evidence while struggling with other data. The myths are similar enough to suggest connection, different enough to resist simple origin stories. Perhaps multiple factors operated simultaneously. Actual floods inspiring local narratives, cultural transmission spreading and modifying those narratives, universal psychological patterns predisposing humans towards certain story structures. The Anunnaki's civil wars appear in this broader context. Divine conflicts occur across mythologies. Titans and Olympians, Aesir and Vanir, Devas and Asuras in Hindu tradition, the war in heaven described in Revelation. Are these independent developments, each culture processing internal tensions through theological narrative? Or do they preserve fragmentary memories of actual conflicts, events that occurred and were mythologized differently by various populations? We may never know with certainty. The evidence is fragmentary, filtered through linguistic and cultural barriers, preserved in text written centuries or millennia after the events they claim to describe. Archaeology reveals physical remains, ruined temples, artifact assemblages, environmental data, but it cannot definitively answer whether gods were real beings, psychological constructs, or something else entirely. What we can say with confidence is that the Anunnaki mattered intensely to the people who believed in them. Their stories were not entertainment but explanation, not fiction but revealed truth about how the cosmos operated. The conflicts among these gods reflected struggles that felt real and pressing. Why do cities fall despite proper worship? Why do floods destroy the righteous alongside the wicked? Why does order repeatedly collapse into chaos despite humanity's best efforts to maintain it? These questions remain relevant. We no longer blame gods for natural disasters, but we still struggle with randomness, with the apparent meaninglessness of suffering, with systems that fail despite being carefully constructed. The Anunnaki civil wars, whatever their literal truth, express something psychologically accurate, that power breeds conflict, that even cosmic order contains the seeds of disorder, that violence erupts even among those who should maintain peace. Perhaps this is why the myths endure, why they generate ongoing debate, why people continue finding meaning in stories written on clay tablets 4,000 years ago. They address permanent aspects of human experience, questions that transcend specific cultural contexts, struggles that remain recognizable across the vast gulf separating us from ancient Mesopotamia. The mystery of what the Anunnaki were, and what their conflicts represented, may be less important than what the questions reveal about us. Our need for explanation, our discomfort with uncertainty, our desire to find patterns in chaos, our hope that someone, whether gods or ancestors, or hidden forces, understands what we cannot. When the last cuneiform tablet was written, probably sometime in the 1st century CE, Mesopotamian civilization had already declined into memory. The Parthians and later the Sassanid Persians controlled the region, but the old cities lay mostly abandoned, their ziggurats eroding back into the desert plain from which they had been built. The priests who once maintained daily rituals for the Anunnaki were gone. The schools where scribes learned to press wedge-shaped marks into clay had closed. The language itself, both Sumerian and Akkadian, faded from living use, preserved only in a few scholarly contexts before disappearing entirely from human knowledge. For nearly 2 millennia, the Anunnaki slept in silence. Travelers passed the ruins of Babylon, Ur, Nineveh, without understanding what they witnessed. The tells, artificial hills formed from successive occupation layers, were taken for natural geography rather than accumulated human effort. Clay tablets, occasionally unearthed by erosion or farmers digging irrigation ditches, were incomprehensible, their wedge-shaped marks unreadable, their meanings lost. The Arabic-speaking peoples who settled Mesopotamia after the Islamic conquests had no memory of what civilization had preceded them. Their own rich tradition stretched back to pre-Islamic poetry, to the Prophet's lifetime in the 7th century CE, to older Middle Eastern cultures including the Jews and Christians, whose sacred texts mentioned Babylon and Assyria. But the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the specific peoples who had created cuneiform and built ziggurats, had vanished from cultural consciousness, yet echoes persisted. The Hebrew Bible preserved fragments, the Tower of Babel clearly referencing Mesopotamian ziggurats, flood narratives that scholarly analysis reveals borrowed from Mesopotamian sources, references to Babylon's fall that drew on older prophetic traditions. Greek historians, including Herodotus, described Babylon's splendor, though by his time in the 5th century BCE, the city had already declined from its Neo-Babylonian peak under Nebuchadnezzar II. These references kept the names alive, Babylon especially, remaining in Western consciousness, a symbol of empire, decadence, and judgment. But the gods themselves were forgotten. Marduk, Enlil, Enki, Inanna, the entire Anunnaki pantheon disappeared from human awareness except as occasional names in surviving texts, whose contexts were no longer understood. The myths describing their conflicts, their creation of humanity, their cosmic governance, all this knowledge resided in tablets buried beneath desert sands, waiting in darkness, patient as stone. The rediscovery began in the 19th century, driven by European imperial competition and scholarly curiosity. French and British expeditions competed to excavate Mesopotamian sites, shipping artifacts to museums in Paris and London. At Nineveh, British archaeologist Austen Henry Layard uncovered the palace of Ashurbanipal, discovering the royal library with its thousands of tablets. At Leonard Woolley's excavations between 1922 and 1934 revealed the royal cemetery, with its elaborate grave goods and evidence of human sacrifice accompanying deceased royalty. But possessing tablets was insufficient. The wedge-shaped marks remained indecipherable until scholars developed methods for reading them. The breakthrough came through the Behistun inscription in western Iran, a trilingual text carved into a cliff face around 520 BCE by order of Persian King Darius I. The inscription repeated the same content in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, 3 different scripts and languages. British officer Henry Rawlinson spent years in the 1830s and 40s copying the inscription under dangerous conditions, suspended on ropes hundreds of feet above the ground. Once scholars could read the Old Persian version using knowledge of related languages, they had the key for deciphering Babylonian cuneiform. From there, working backward through bilingual tablets and careful linguistic analysis, they gradually learned to read Akkadian and eventually Sumerian, the oldest written language, with no living descendants or closely related tongues to aid translation. This process transformed understanding of human history. Suddenly, civilization's origins pushed back over a millennium before previously known literate cultures. The Sumerians emerged from obscurity, revealed as inventors of writing, cities, monumental architecture, sophisticated mathematics and astronomy. Their myths, preserved on tablets stored in museum basements, began speaking again after 2,000 years of silence. In 1872, George Smith, a young British museum assistant working on the tablet collection from Nineveh, discovered a fragment describing a flood narrative remarkably similar to the biblical account in Genesis. The text featured a hero named Utnapishtim, who built an ark, survived divine flood, released birds to test for dry land. The parallels were unmistakable and theologically provocative, suggesting biblical narratives had Mesopotamian precursors. Smith's announcement created sensation. The Daily Telegraph newspaper funded an expedition for him to return to Nineveh, specifically searching for missing portions of the tablet. Remarkably, in the debris of Ashurbanipal's library, Smith found a fragment that fit perfectly into the gap, completing a crucial section of the narrative. The odds of this discovery were astronomical, one fragment among tens of thousands proving to be exactly what he sought. Yet it happened. The discovery established that Genesis flood narratives derived from earlier Mesopotamian sources, that biblical writers had been influenced by or directly borrowed from cuneiform traditions. This realization transformed biblical scholarship, revealing the Hebrew scriptures as products of cultural context rather than unique divine revelation untouched by surrounding literatures. But it also meant the gods were speaking again. Enlil's fury at human noise, Enki's preservation of the flood hero, the divine assembly's decisions and conflicts, all this became accessible to modern readers. The Anunnaki, forgotten for millennia, returned to human consciousness, their stories translated into dozens of languages, their names and attributes studied in universities, their myths analyzed for historical, literary, and theological significance. Modern technology continues accelerating the pace of discovery. Digital humanities projects use computer analysis to identify tablet fragments that belong together, virtually reconstructing broken texts without physical handling that might damage fragile clay. Machine learning algorithms trained on cuneiform script can read damaged tablets that human eyes struggle with, filling gaps where erosion has partially obscured signs. Satellite imaging reveals buried structures, guiding excavations toward undiscovered sites. The Iraq Museum in Baghdad holds extensive cuneiform collections. Though the 2003 looting during the Iraq War resulted in devastating losses, thousands of artifacts stolen or destroyed, international efforts recovered some items, but many remain missing, sold into private collections, or destroyed by looters seeking precious metals without understanding the clay tablet's scholarly value. This loss is incalculable, knowledge that survived 4,000 years destroyed in days of chaos. Yet more tablets are discovered regularly, Construction projects uncover ancient buildings, legal and illegal excavations continue, private collections occasionally surface, their origins sometimes murky, but their contents potentially valuable for scholarship. Each new text has the potential to revise understanding, to reveal previously unknown myths, to provide missing context for fragmentary narratives. The question scholars now debate is whether we have found the most significant texts, or whether major discoveries still await. The Enuma Elish, the Atrahasis epic, the Descent of Inanna, the Era epic, all survived because multiple copies existed, because scribal schools used them as teaching texts, because they were considered important enough to preserve through careful copying across centuries. But what myths existed in only a few copies? What stories were lost when libraries burned or tablets crumbled? What knowledge was transmitted orally and never committed to clay? We may never know what we've lost. The silence is vast, encompassing not just unknown texts but entire ways of understanding the world, theological concepts that were assumed rather than stated, ritual practices never documented because they were considered too obvious or too secret to record. What we possess represents fragments, survival of the fortunate, bias toward what priests considered worth preserving. Standing in museums where these tablets rest in archival storage, you feel the weight of that partial recovery. Each box of fragments represents years of potential scholarly work, texts that might illuminate currently obscure references, that might connect previously separate narratives, that might revolutionize understanding of how ancient Mesopotamians conceived divine nature and cosmic order. The gods sleep in these fragments, dormant but not dead, waiting for scholars patient enough to piece together broken clay, to puzzle out damaged signs, to contextualize fragmentary references within broader mythological frameworks. The Anunnaki's conflicts, their creation of humanity, their floods and rebellions and wars, all this knowledge rests here, accessible yet still largely unintegrated into contemporary consciousness. Perhaps this is fitting. The gods were always patient, operating on timescales measured in centuries and millennia, rather than human lifetimes. Their return to awareness after 2,000 years of silence suggests they are content to wait, to reveal themselves gradually as humans develop capacity to understand what the tablets preserve. The mystery is not whether more will be discovered. Scholarship ensures that ongoing translation and analysis will continue yielding insights, but whether we can fully bridge the cognitive distance between our worldview and theirs. We read myths as literature, as historical documents, as data for analysis. They experience these stories as revelation, as explanation for how existence operated, as connection to forces governing reality at levels beyond human control. That experiential gap may be impossible to fully close. We cannot believe as they believed, cannot experience gods as immediate presences rather than abstract concepts, cannot structure our societies around temples serving divine owners of land and resources. Too much has changed, too many revolutions in thought and technology separate us from them. Yet the myths still speak, still provoke wonder, still raise questions about power and conflict, order and chaos, the struggle to maintain civilization against forces that seem determined to tear it apart. Perhaps this is all memory can do, not preserve exact experience, but transmit essential patterns, not maintain perfect continuity, but provide enough connection that later generations can recognize something familiar in stories told by ancestors they will never meet, preserved in languages no longer spoken, pressed into clay that has outlasted empires. The gods never truly left. They transformed, migrated, wore different names in different languages, but their essential patterns persisted through millennia of cultural change. When Mesopotamian civilization collapsed under successive invasions, Persian, Greek, Parthian, Roman, the stories did not vanish but adapted, fragments absorbed into new traditions, mythological DNA recombining in unexpected ways. The biblical flood narrative preserves the clearest example. Scholars have demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt that Genesis chapters 6 through 9, describing Noah's Ark and the deluge, draw directly from Mesopotamian sources. The parallels are too specific to be coincidental. The divine decision to flood the earth, the selection of one righteous man to preserve life, the construction of a massive boat following precise dimensions, the release of birds to test for dry land, the offering of sacrifice after survival, even details like the number of days the flood lasts. The Hebrew scribes who compiled Genesis knew Mesopotamian traditions, likely from the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE, and incorporated flood mythology into their own theological framework. But the borrowing transformed meaning. In the Atrahasis epic, gods flood the earth because human noise disturbs their rest, a seemingly petty motivation. In Genesis, the flood represents moral judgment, punishment for widespread wickedness, with Noah preserved specifically for his righteousness. The same narrative structure, conveys radically different theological messages: Mesopotamian pragmatism about divine nature versus Judaic emphasis on moral order and covenant relationship. Greek mythology absorbed and reinterpreted Mesopotamian motifs. The Titanomachy, the war between Titans and Olympians, echoes the generational conflict between Tiamat and Marduk, older chaos versus younger order. Prometheus stealing fire for humanity parallels Enki's preservation of knowledge against divine decree. The descent of Persephone to the underworld and her periodic return, creating seasons, directly mirrors Inanna's descent and Dumuzi's alternating imprisonment. These were not conscious borrowings necessarily, but cultural transmission through trade networks, shared storytelling, the gradual diffusion of mythological patterns across interconnected ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern worlds. Islamic tradition preserved Mesopotamian geography in theological imagination. The Quran describes the Tower of Babel, identifies Babylon as a place of ancient power and eventual judgment. Medieval Islamic scholars knew Mesopotamia had been home to great civilizations before Islam, though they lacked ability to read cuneiform and could not access the specific mythologies preserved in tablets buried beneath tells. The region remained theologically significant, a landscape where prophetic history unfolded, where divine judgment had been enacted, where the struggles between faith and empire played out across centuries. European travelers in the 16th through 18th centuries visited Mesopotamian ruins, sketching ziggurats and speculating about their purpose. Pietro della Valle, an Italian nobleman traveling in 1616, was the first European to recognize the wedge-shaped marks on ancient bricks as writing rather than decoration. He collected samples, bringing them to Europe where scholars examined them with curiosity, but no understanding of how to read them. The 19th century brought systematic excavation and eventual decipherment. French consul Paul-Émile Botta began digging at Khorsabad in 1842, uncovering the palace of Assyrian king Sargon II with its massive stone bulls guarding entrances, its walls covered in cuneiform inscriptions describing military campaigns and building projects. British diplomat Austen Henry Layard excavated Nimrud and Nineveh between 1845 and 1851, discovering palaces, libraries, monumental sculpture that transformed European understanding of ancient Near Eastern civilization. The process of learning to read cuneiform took decades of painstaking work. Henry Rawlinson's copying of the Behistun inscription provided the crucial breakthrough, but moving from deciphering Persian and Akkadian to understanding Sumerian required generations of scholars building on each other's work. Each translated text illuminated grammar and vocabulary for subsequent translations, a gradual accumulation of knowledge that accelerated as more tablets were read and catalogued. George Smith's discovery of the flood narrative in 1872 captured public imagination in ways purely scholarly findings rarely achieve. Here was proof that biblical stories had ancient parallels, that Genesis was not isolated revelation but participant in broader Near Eastern literary tradition. The implications troubled some religious believers but excited scholars, revealing previously unknown dimensions of how ancient peoples understood creation, catastrophe, divine intervention in human affairs. The 20th century brought increasingly sophisticated archaeological techniques. Excavations became more careful, recording stratigraphic context, preserving small finds that earlier digs discarded as insignificant. Pottery analysis allowed precise dating of occupation layers. Aerial photography revealed ancient irrigation systems and city layouts invisible from ground level. Ground-penetrating radar mapped buried structures without excavation. Carbon-14 dating provided absolute chronology, where previously only relative sequences existed. Each advance revealed new complexity. The Sumerians, who scholars in 1900 believed were the first civilizations, were discovered to have had predecessors. The Ubaid culture, whose pottery and architecture predated Sumerian by over a millennium. The simple progression from villages to cities proved more complicated, involving trade networks, climate changes, social innovations in ways that resist linear explanation. Even now, in the 21st century, discoveries continue. In 2015, digital humanities researchers at Oxford identified previously unknown fragments of the Epic of Gilgamesh, adding 20 new lines to the text, including more detailed description of the cedar forest that Gilgamesh and Enkidu entered to battle Humbaba. The fragments had been catalogued for decades but misidentified, only recognized when computer algorithms matching cuneiform signs suggested they belonged to the epic. Iraqi archaeologists, despite ongoing political instability and limited resources, continue excavating and studying Mesopotamian sites. International collaborations bring advanced technology to bear on long-standing questions. Satellite imaging reveals ancient canals and field systems, showing how irrigation supported dense populations. Chemical analysis of pottery residues determines what was stored and traded. DNA analysis of skeletal remains traces population movements and relationships between ancient cities. The Islamic State's destruction of Mosul museum artifacts in 2015, including Assyrian sculptures and numerous tablets, demonstrated how fragile this knowledge remains. Militants sledgehammered statues, bulldozed archaeological sites, deliberately targeting cultural heritage as part of their rejection of pre-Islamic history. International outcry led to some recoveries and renewed efforts to document vulnerable sites digitally, creating virtual preservation even if physical artifacts are destroyed. But beyond academic scholarship and museum collections, the Anunnaki have experienced strange renaissance in popular culture. The ancient astronaut hypothesis, despite scholarly rejection, thrives in documentaries, books, internet forums, capturing imaginations with the possibility that gods were extraterrestrial visitors. This popular interest, while often built on misinterpretations and methodological errors, reveals persistent hunger for connection to ancient mysteries, for explanations that transcend conventional narratives. Perhaps this hunger reflects something the myths themselves addressed. The sense that existence involves more than visible surfaces suggest that forces operate beyond human control or full comprehension, that our origins might be stranger than comfortable explanations allow. Whether those forces are gods, aliens, or simply the immense complexity of how civilizations emerge and collapse, the impulse to seek deeper meaning remains constant across cultures and centuries. Standing today where once stood, where the ziggurat of Nana still rises partially reconstructed above the desert plain, you can see how time layers meaning. The ancient bricks, some original from 2100 BCE, others replaced during Saddam Hussein's reconstructions in the 1980s, mix past and present in ways that blur simple chronology. Tourists walk where priests once climbed to perform rituals for a god in whom no one now believes, yet the structure persists, monument to the reality that belief once held. The same stars that the Sumerians identified with their gods still wheel overhead each night. Venus rises as evening star, bright and steady in the western sky. The planet Inanna rode between earth and heaven. Jupiter, Marduk's celestial form, traces its 12-year path through the zodiac. The constellations the Mesopotamians named and catalogued remain recognizable, patterns connecting us across 4,000 years to people who looked up and saw divine drama enacted in celestial mechanics. What they understood about divine conflict, about the struggles for power and supremacy that shaped their myths, remains relevant. We no longer blame gods for natural disasters or military defeats, but we still grapple with how power corrupts, how ambition breeds conflict, how even well-intentioned systems contain seeds of their own destruction. The Anunnaki civil wars, whatever their literal truth, expressed permanent aspects of how hierarchies function and fail, how those who govern often turn against each other, how ordinary people suffer from conflicts among their supposed protectors. The legacy is not just academic, not confined to scholars reading tablets or archaeologists excavating tells. It lives in every flood narrative told to children, in every story of gods at war, in every recognition that cosmic order is fragile and provisional, maintained only through constant effort and frequently failing despite best intentions. The Mesopotamians learned this truth and pressed it into clay with such force that the impressions remain readable 4 millennia later, speaking to us across silence about struggles that never quite end, questions that never find final answers, mysteries that remain mysterious even when partially illuminated. Their voices reach us now, tonight, as you listen in darkness wherever you are. The wedge-shaped marks they pressed into soft clay have outlasted empires, outlasted their entire civilization, carrying forward something essential about human experience: the need to explain, the impulse to find meaning in suffering, the hope that someone somewhere understands what we cannot. The story of the Anunnaki's conflicts becomes our story, not because we believe in these specific gods, but because the patterns they embody persist. Power still corrupts, ambition still breeds violence, order still collapses into chaos despite every effort to maintain it, and we still press our understanding into whatever medium our time provides, hoping it will outlast us, reaching forward to descendants we'll never meet, offering them what the Sumerians offered us: testimony that we were here, that we struggled to understand, that we found meaning, even in mysteries that resisted solution. The gods are silent now in a way they never were for the people who built temples and pressed tablets. But silence is not absence. It is patience, the deep stillness of stone waiting to speak, of stars unchanged since the world was young, of questions that persist, because they address something permanent in how consciousness encounters existence and demands explanation. The tablets rest in museum storage, each one catalogued and archived, their clay surfaces holding wedge-shaped secrets pressed 4,000 years ago by hands long returned to dust. The gods they describe, the Anunnaki who descended from heaven, who created humanity from clay and divine blood, who flooded the world and warred among themselves, have been silent for 2 millennia. No temples receive offerings in their names. No priests chant their myths as living liturgy. The divine assembly no longer convenes to decree the fates of cities and kings. Yet something persists. Not belief exactly, not worship, but recognition of the patterns those myths expressed. We still watch as power corrupts those who wield it, as ambition turns allies into enemies, as conflicts escalate beyond what anyone intended, until destruction becomes inevitable. The names have changed. The gods wear different faces or no faces at all, but the struggles continue in forms the Sumerians would recognize, order maintained with difficulty, chaos always threatening to break through. The question of who governs and by what right, never finally settled. Where you are right now, wherever this finds you, the same stars wheel overhead that the Mesopotamians watched and recorded. Venus rises in the west after sunset, or in the east before dawn, still the morning and evening star, still bright enough to cast shadows though we rarely notice in our illuminated nights. Jupiter traces its patient path, 12 years to complete one circuit through the zodiac, moving tonight as it moved when Babylon was young. The constellations they named, the celestial markers they used to track seasons and predict events, remain recognizable despite the slow procession that gradually shifts their positions across millennia. The ruins themselves wait in patient silence. Ur's ziggurat still rises above the desert plain, its baked brick facades partially restored, its ancient core exposed where erosion has worn through later reconstructions. Babylon's outline can still be traced in tells and excavated streets, though Alexander's city and Nebuchadnezzar's city and the original Amorite settlement all layer atop each other in archaeological confusion. Eridu, the oldest, sits mostly unexcavated, its temple sequence descending through meters of accumulated deposits into prehistory, where writing had not yet captured human memory in permanent form. These stones remember in their way, not consciously, not as beings capable of thought or speech, but through persistence. They hold the shapes humans gave them, the positions where hands placed them, the purposes for which they were assembled into temples and walls and platforms. They remember through being what they were made to be, through continuing to exist when everything else, the people and the beliefs and the civilizations that created them, has passed into memory and myth. What the Anunnaki were, whether gods or myths or memories of something we can no longer fully grasp, matters less now than what they mean. They mean that humans have always struggled to understand power and its consequences, that we have always told stories about forces beyond our control, that we have always pressed our explanations into whatever medium our time provides, hoping it will outlast us. The Sumerians chose clay, wedge-shaped marks that hardened into messages durable enough to survive 40 centuries. We choose different media now, but the impulse remains constant. The mysteries endure because they were designed to endure. Not all questions demand answers. Not all stories require conclusions. Some truths exist in the asking, rather than any response, in the willingness to wonder, rather than the achievement of certainty. The Anunnaki civil wars, whether they occurred as literal battles or symbolic conflicts or something between these categories, teach us that even cosmic order contains fractures, that even those who govern cannot always govern themselves, that violence emerges even from structures meant to prevent it. This knowledge brings no comfort but offers something else: recognition. We are not the first to face these questions, not the first to watch as order collapses, not the first to wonder whether those in power deserve that power or maintain it through force and fortunate circumstance. The Mesopotamians pressed these observations into clay with such conviction that the tablets remain readable, speaking across impossible spans of time to tell us we are not alone in our struggles, not unique in our doubts, not isolated in our recognition that existence is more mysterious than any explanation fully captures. Sleep now. If sleep is what you seek, or rest in quiet awareness, letting the weight of deep time settle around you like a comfortable darkness, the gods who once decreed fates and flooded worlds have returned to whatever silence they came from, their temples empty, their names preserved only in scholarly publications and museum displays. But the stars they watched still burn, the clay that held their stories still endures, and somewhere in the space between what was remembered and what was forgotten, between what we know and what we can never know, the mystery continues its patient waiting. The wind still moves over Mesopotamian ruins, carrying dust from bricks that were temples, shifting sand across foundations where gods were thought to dwell. The Euphrates still flows, though its course has changed, though the cities it once nourished have returned to desert, and the night sky still turns, vast and indifferent and beautiful, holding in its wheeling patterns The same questions that troubled the first people who looked up and wondered what forces governed the darkness, who named the stars and told stories about divine conflicts playing out in celestial mechanics. The stillness holds everything, the questions and the silence that follows, the ruins and the memories they preserve, the myths and the mysteries they contain. Nothing is resolved, nothing needs to be. Some stories continue, not through endings, but through their refusal to end, through persistence across time, through the quiet recognition that what mattered once still matters, changed but not erased, forgotten but not gone, sleeping in clay and stone and the spaces between stars, waiting patiently for whoever comes next to wonder, to question, to press their own understanding into whatever survives, hoping it will speak to a future they cannot imagine,